To Rome by Pisa and Siena. There is nothing in Italy more beautiful to me than the coastal road between Genoa and Spezia. On one side, sometimes far below, sometimes nearly on a level with the road, and often skirted by broken rocks of many shapes, there is a free blue sea, with here and there a picturesque felucca gliding slowly on. On the other side are lofty hills, ravines besprinkled with white cottages, patches of dark olive woods, country churches with their light open towers, and country houses gaily painted. On every bank and knoll by the wayside, the wild cactus and aloe flourish in exuberant profusion, and the gardens of the bright villages along the road are seen all blushing in the summer time with clusters of the belladonna, and are fragrant in the autumn and winter with golden oranges and lemons. Some of the villages are inhabited almost exclusively by fishermen, and it is pleasant to see their great boats hauled up on the beach, making little patches of shade where they lie asleep, or where the women and children sit romping and looking out to sea, while they mend their nets upon the shore. There is one town, Camoglia, with its little harbour on the sea, hundreds of feet below the road, where families of mariners live who, time out of mind, have owned coasting vessels in that place, and have traded to Spain and elsewhere. Seen from the road above, it is like a tiny model on the margin of the dimpled water, shining in the sun. Descended into by the winding mule tracks, it is a perfect miniature of a primitive seafaring town, the saltest, roughest, most piratical little place that ever was seen. Great rusty iron rings and mooring chains, capstans, and fragments of old masts and spars choke up the way. Hardy rough-weather boats and seamen's clothing flutter in the little harbour, or are drawn out to the sunny stones to dry. On the parapet of the rude pier, a few amphibious-looking fellows lie asleep, with their legs dangling over the wall, as though earth or water were all one to them, and if they slipped in, they would float away, dozing comfortably among the fishes. The church is bright with trophies of the sea and votive offerings in commemoration of escape from storm and shipwreck. The dwellings not immediately abutting on the harbour are approached by blind low archways and by crooked steps, as if in darkness and in difficulty of access they should be like holds of ships or inconvenient cabins under water. And everywhere there is a smell of fish and seaweed and old rope. The coastal road whence Camoglia is descried so far below is famous in the warm season, especially in some parts near Genoa, for fireflies. Walking there on a dark night, I have seen it made one sparkling firmament by these beautiful insects, so that the distant stars were pale against a flash and glitter that spangled every olive wood and hillside, and pervaded the whole air. It was not in such a season, however, that we traversed this road on our way to Rome. The middle of January was only just past, and it was very gloomy and dark weather, very wet besides. In crossing the fine pass of Bracco, we entered such a storm of mist and rain that we travelled in a cloud the whole way. There might have been no Mediterranean in the world, for anything that we saw of it there, except when a sudden gust of wind, clearing the mist before it for a moment, showed the agitated sea at a great depth below, lashing the distant rocks and spouting up its foam furiously. The rain was incessant, every brook and torrent was greatly swollen, and such a deafening leaping and roaring and thundering of water I never heard the like of in my life. Hence, when we came to Spezia, we found that the Magra, an unbridged river on the high road to Pisa, was too high to be safely crossed in the ferry-boat, and were fain to wait until the afternoon of next day, when it had, in some degree, subsided. Spezia, however, is a good place to tarry at, by reason, firstly, of its beautiful bay, secondly, of its ghostly inn, thirdly, of the head-dress of the women, who wear, on one side of their head a small doll's straw hat stuck onto the hair, which is certainly the oddest and most roughish headgear that ever was invented. The Magra safely crossed in the ferry boat. The passage is not by any means agreeable when the current is swollen and strong. We arrived at Carrara within a few hours. In good time next morning we got some ponies and went out to see the marble quarries. There are 4 or 5 great glens running up in a range of lofty hills until they can run no longer and are stopped by being abruptly strangled by nature. The quarries, or caves, as they call them there, are so many openings high up in the hills on either side of these passes where they blast and excavate for marble, which may turn out good or bad, may make a man's fortune very quickly, or ruin him by the great expense of working what is worth nothing. Some of these caves were opened by the ancient Romans, and remain as they left them to this hour. Many others are being worked at this moment. Others are to be begun tomorrow, next week, next month. Others are unbought, unthought of, and marble enough for more ages that have passed since the place was resorted to lies hidden everywhere, patiently awaiting its time of discovery. As you toil and clamber up one of these steep gorges, having left your pony sodden in his girth in water a mile or 2 lower down, you hear every now and then, echoing among the hills in a low tone, more silent than the previous silence, a melancholy warning bugle, a signal to the miners to withdraw. Then there is a thundering and echoing from hill to hill, and perhaps a splashing up of great fragments of rock into the air. And on you toil again until some other bugle sounds in a new direction, and you stop directly, lest you should come within the range of the new explosion. There were numbers of men working high up in these hills, on the sides, clearing away and sending down the broken masses of stone and earth to make way for the blocks of marble that had been discovered. As these came rolling down from unseen hands into the narrow valley, I could not help thinking of the deep glen, just the same sort of glen, where the rock left Sinbad the sailor, and where the merchants from the heights above flung down great pieces of meat for the diamonds to stick to. There were no eagles here to darken the sun in their swoop, and pounce upon them, but it was as wild and fierce as if there had been hundreds. But the road down which the marble comes, however immense the blocks. The genius of the country and the spirit of its institutions pave that road, repair it, watch it, keep it going. Conceive a channel of water running over a rocky bed, beset with great heaps of stone of all shapes and sizes, winding down the middle of this valley, and that being the road because it was the road 500 years ago. Imagine the clumsy carts of 500 years ago being used to this hour and drawn, as they used to be 500 years ago, by oxen, whose ancestors were worn to death 500 years ago, as their unhappy descendants are now, in 12 months, by the suffering and agony of this cruel work. 2 pairs, 4 pairs, 10 pairs, 20 pairs to one block, according to its size. Down it must come, this way. In their struggling from stone to stone, with their enormous loads behind them, they die frequently upon the spot. And not only they alone, for their passionate drivers, sometimes tumbling down in their energy, are crushed to death beneath the wheels. But it was good 500 years ago, and it must be good now. And a railroad down one of these steeps, the easiest thing in the world, would be flat blasphemy. When we stood aside to see one of these cars drawn by only a pair of oxen, for it had but one small block of marble on it, coming down, I hailed in my heart the man who sat upon the heavy yoke to keep it on the neck of the poor beasts, and who faced backwards, not before him, as the very devil of true despotism. He had a great rod in his hand, with an iron point, and when they could plough and force their way through the loose bed of the torrent no longer, and came to a stop, he poked it into their bodies, beat it on their heads, screwed it round and round in their nostrils, got them on a yard or two in the madness of intense pain, repeated all these persuasions with increased intensity of purpose when they stopped again, got them on once more, forced and goaded them to an abrupter point of the descent, and when their writhing and smarting, and the weight behind them, bore them plunging down the precipice in a cloud of scattered water, whirled his rod above his head, and gave a great whoop and hallo, as if he had achieved something, and had no idea that they might shake him off, and blindly mash his brains upon the road in the noontide of his triumph. Standing in one of the many study of Carrara that afternoon, for it is a great workshop full of beautiful finished copies in marble of almost every figure, group, and bust we know, it seemed at first so strange to me that those exquisite shapes, replete with grace and thought and delicate repose, should grow out of all this toil and sweat and torture. But I soon found a parallel to it, and an explanation of it, in every virtue that springs up in miserable ground, and every good thing that has its birth in sorrow and distress. And, looking out of the sculptor's great window upon the marble mountains, all red and glowing in the decline of day, but stern and solemn to the last, I thought, my God! How many quarries of human hearts and souls, capable of far more beautiful results, are left shut up and mouldering away, while pleasure travellers through life avert their faces as they pass, and shudder at the gloom and ruggedness that conceal them. The then reigning Duke of Modena, to whom this territory in part belonged, claimed the proud distinction of being the only sovereign in Europe who had not recognized Louis Philippe as King of the French. He was not a wag, but quite in earnest. He was also much opposed to railroads, and, if certain lying in contemplation by other potentates on either side of him had been executed, would have probably enjoyed the satisfaction of having an omnibus plying to and fro across his not very vast dominions to forward travellers from one terminus to another. Carrara, shut in by great hills, is very picturesque and bold. Few tourists stay there, and the people are nearly all connected in one way or other with the working of marble. There are also villages among the caves where the workmen live. It contains a beautiful little theatre, newly built, and it is an interesting custom there to form the chorus of labourers in the marble quarries, who are self-taught and sing by ear. I heard them in a comic opera and in an act of Norma, and they acquitted themselves very well, unlike the common people of Italy generally, who, with some exceptions among the Neapolitans, sing vilely out of tune, and have very disagreeable singing voices. From the summit of a lofty hill beyond Carrara, the first view of the fertile plain in which the town of Pisa lies, with Leghorn, a purple spot in the flat distance, is enchanting. Nor is it only distance that lends enchantment to the view, for the fruitful country and rich woods of olive trees through which the road subsequently passes render it delightful. The moon was shining when we approached Pisa, and for a long time we could see, behind the wall, the leaning tower, all awry in the uncertain light, the shadowy original of the old pictures in school-books, setting forth the wonders of the world. Like most things connected in their first association with schoolbooks and school times, it was too small. I felt it keenly. It was nothing like so high above the wall as I had hoped. It was another of the many deceptions practised by Mr. Harris, bookseller, at the corner of St. Paul's Churchyard, London. His tower was a fiction, but this was reality, and, by comparison, a short reality. Still, it looked very well, and very strange, and was quite as much out of the perpendicular as Harris had represented it to be. The quiet air of Pisa, too, the big guard-house at the gate, with only 2 little soldiers in it, the streets with scarcely any show of people in them, and the Arno, following quaintly through the centre of the town, were excellent. So, I bore no malice in my heart against Mr. Harris, remembering his good intentions, but forgave him before dinner and went out full of confidence to see the tower next morning. I might have known better, but somehow I had expected to see it casting its long shadow on a public street where people came and went all day. It was a surprise to me to find it in a grave-retired place, apart from the general resort, and carpeted with smooth green turf. But the group of buildings clustered on and about this verdant carpet, comprising the tower, the baptistry, the cathedral, and the church of the Camposanto, is perhaps the most remarkable and beautiful in the whole world. And from being clustered there together, away from the ordinary transactions and details of the town, they have a singularly venerable and impressive character. It is the architectural essence of a rich old city, with all its common life and common habitations pressed out and filtered away. Simond compares the tower to the usual pictorial representations in children's books of the Tower of Babel. It is a happy simile, and conveys a better idea of the building than chapters of laboured description. Nothing can exceed the grace and lightness of the structure. Nothing can be more remarkable than its general appearance. In the course of the ascent to the top, which is by an easy staircase, the inclination is not very apparent, but at the summit it becomes so, and gives one the sensation of being in a ship that has heeled over through the action of an ebb tide. The effect upon the low side, so to speak, looking over from the gallery and seeing the shaft recede to its base, is very startling, and I saw a nervous traveller hold on to the tower involuntarily after glancing down, as if he had some idea of propping it up. The view within from the ground, looking up as through a slanted tube, is also very curious. It certainly inclines as much as the most sanguine tourist could desire. The natural impulse of 99 people out of 100 who were about to recline upon the grass below it to rest and contemplate the adjacent buildings would probably be not to take up their position under the leaning side. It is so very much aslant. The manifold beauties of the cathedral and baptistry need no recapitulation from me, though in this case, as in 100 others, I find it difficult to separate my own delight in recalling them from your weariness in having them recalled. There is a picture of Saint Agnes by Andrea del Sarto in the former, and there are a variety of rich columns in the latter that tempt me strongly. It is, I hope, no breach of my resolution not to be tempted into elaborate descriptions, to remember the Camposanto, where grass-grown graves are dug in earth brought more than 600 years ago from the Holy Land, and where they are surrounding them such cloisters with such playing lights and shadows falling through their delicate tracery on the stone pavement, as surely the dullest memory could never forget. On the walls of this solemn and lovely place are ancient frescoes, very much obliterated and decayed, but very curious. As usually happens in almost any collection of paintings of any sort in Italy, where there are many heads, there is in one of them a striking accidental likeness of Napoleon. At one time, I used to please my fancy with the speculation whether these old painters at their work had a foreboding knowledge of the man who would one day arise to wreak such destruction upon art, whose soldiers would make targets of great pictures and stable their horses among triumphs of architecture. But the same Corsican face is so plentiful in some parts of Italy at this day that a more commonplace solution of the coincidence is unavoidable. If Pisa be the seventh wonder of the world in right of its tower, it may claim to be, at least, the second or third in right of its beggars. They waylay the unhappy visitor at every turn, escort him to every door he enters at, and lie in wait for him with strong reinforcements at every door by which they know he must come out. The grating on the portal of its hinges is the signal for a general shout, and the moment he appears, he is hemmed in and fallen on by heaps of rags and personal distortions. The beggars seem to embody all the trade and enterprise of Pisa. Nothing else is stirring but warm air. Going through the streets, the front of the sleepy houses look like backs. They are all so still and quiet, and unlike houses with people in them, that the greater part of the city has the appearance of a city at daybreak, or during a general siesta of the population. Or it is yet more like those backgrounds of houses in common prints or old engravings, where windows and doors are squarely indicated, and one figure, a beggar of course, is seen walking off by itself into illimitable perspective. Not so Leghorn, made illustrious by Smollett's grave, which is a thriving, business-like, matter-of-fact place where idleness is shouldered out of the way by commerce. The regulations observed there, in reference to trade and merchants, are very liberal and free, and the town, of course, benefits by them. Leghorn had a bad name in connection with stabbers, and with some justice it must be allowed. For not many years ago there was an assassination club there, the members of which bore no ill will to anybody in particular, but stabbed people, quite strangers to them, in the streets at night, for the pleasure and excitement of the recreation. I think the president of this amiable society was a shoemaker. He was taken, however, and the club was broken up. It would probably have disappeared in the natural course of events before the railroad between Leghorn and Pisa, which is a good one and has already begun to astonish Italy with the precedent of punctuality, order, plain dealing, and improvement, the most dangerous and heretical astonisher of all. There must have been a slight sensation, as of earthquake surely, in the Vatican when the first Italian railroad was thrown open. Returning to Pisa and hiring a good-tempered vetturino and his 4 horses to take us on to Rome, we travelled through pleasant Tuscan villages and cheerful scenery all day. The roadside crosses in this part of Italy are numerous and curious. There is seldom a figure on the cross, though there is sometimes a face, but they are remarkable for being garnished with little models in wood of every possible object that can be connected with the Saviour's death. The cock that crowed when Peter had denied his master thrice is usually perched on the tip-top, and an ornithological phenomenon he generally is. Under him is the inscription. Then, hung on the cross-beam, are the spear, the reed with a sponge of vinegar and water at the end, the coat without seams for which the soldiers cast lots, the dice-box with which they threw for it, the hammer that drove in the nails, the pincers that pulled them out, the ladder which was set against the cross, the crown of thorns, the instrument of flagellation, the lanthorn with which Mary went to the tomb, I suppose, and the sword with which Peter smote the servant of the high priest. A perfect toy shop of little objects repeated at every 4 or 5 miles all along the highway. On the evening of the second day from Pisa, we reached the beautiful old city of Siena. There was what they called a carnival in progress, but as its secrets lay in a score or 2 of melancholy people walking up and down the principal street in common toy-shop masks, and being more melancholy, if possible, than the same sort of people in England, I say no more of it. We went off betimes next morning to see the cathedral, which is wonderfully picturesque inside and out, especially the latter, also the marketplace or great piazza, which is a large square with a great broken-nosed fountain in it, some quaint Gothic houses, and a high square brick tower, outside the top of which, a curious feature in such views in Italy, hangs an enormous bell. It is like a bit of Venice without the water. There are some curious old palazzi in the town, which is very ancient, and without having, for me, the interest of Verona or Genoa, it is very dreamy and fantastic, and most interesting. We went on again as soon as we had seen these things, and going over a rather bleak country, there had been nothing but vines until now, mere walking-sticks at that season of the year, stopped, as usual, between 1 and 2 hours in the middle of the day to rest the horses, that being part of every vetturino contract. We then went on again, through a region gradually becoming bleaker and wilder until it became as bare and desolate as any Scottish moors. Soon after dark, we halted for the night at the Osteria of La Scala, a perfectly lonely house where the family was sitting round a great fire in the kitchen, raised on a stone platform 3 or 4 feet high and big enough for the roasting of an ox. On the upper and only other floor of this hotel there was a great, wild, rambling sala with one very little window in a by-corner, and 4 black doors opening into 4 black bedrooms in various directions, to say nothing of another larger black door opening into another large black sala, with a staircase coming abruptly through a kind of trapdoor in the floor, and the rafters of the roof looming above, a suspicious little press skulking in one obscure corner, and all the knives in the house laying about in various directions. The fireplace was of the purest Italian architecture, so that it was perfectly impossible to see it for the smoke. The waitress was like a dramatic brigand's wife, and wore the same style of dress upon her head. The dogs barked like mad. The echoes returned the compliments bestowed upon them. There was not another house within 12 miles, and things had a dreary and rather a cutthroat appearance. They were not improved by rumours of robbers having come out strong and boldly within a few nights, and of their having stopped the mail very near that place. They were known to have waylaid some travellers not long before on Mount Vesuvius itself, and were the talk of all the roadside inns. As they were no business of ours, however, for we had very little with us to lose, we made ourselves merry on the subject, and were very soon as comfortable as need be. We had the usual dinner in this solitary house, and a very good dinner it is when you are used to it. There is something with a vegetable or some rice in it, which is a sort of shorthand or arbitrary character for soup, and which tastes very well when you have flavoured it with plenty of grated cheese, lots of salt, and abundance of pepper. There is a half fowl of which this soup has been made. There is a stewed pigeon, with the gizzards and livers of himself and other birds stuck all around him. There is a bit of roast beef, the size of a small French roll. There are a scrap of Parmesan cheese, and 5 little withered apples, all huddled together on a small plate, and crowding one upon the other, as if each were trying to save itself from the chance of being eaten. Then there is coffee, and then there is bed. You don't mind brick floors. You don't mind yawning doors, nor banging windows. You don't mind your own horse being stabled under the bed, and so close that every time a horse coughs or sneezes, he wakes you. If you are good-humoured to the people about you, and speak pleasantly, and look cheerful, take my word for it, you may be well entertained in the very worst Italian inn, and always in the most obliging manner, and may go from one end of the country to the other, despite all stories to the contrary, without any great trial of your patience anywhere. Especially when you get such wine in flasks as the Orvieto and the Montepulciano. It was a bad morning when we left this place, and we went for 12 miles over a country as barren, as stony, and as wild as Cornwall in England, until we came to Radicofani, where there is a ghostly goblin inn, once a hunting seat belonging to the Dukes of Tuscany. It is full of such rambling corridors and gaunt rooms that all the murdering and phantom tales that ever were written might have originated in that one house. There are some horrible old palazzi in Genoa, one in particular, not unlike it outside. But there is a winding, creaking, wormy, rustling, door-opening, foot-on-staircase falling character about this Radicofani hotel, such as I never saw anywhere else. The town, such as it is, hangs on a hillside above the house and in front of it. The inhabitants are all beggars, and as soon as they see a carriage coming, they swoop down upon it like so many birds of prey. When we got on the mountain pass, which lies beyond this place, the wind, as they had forewarned us at the inn, was so terrific that we were obliged to take my other half out of the carriage, lest she should be blown over, carriage and all, and to hang to it on the windy side, as well as we could for laughing, to prevent its going heaven knows where. For mere force of wind, this landstorm might have competed with an Atlantic gale and had a reasonable chance of coming off victorious. The blast came sweeping down great gullies in a range of mountains on the right, so that we looked with positive awe at a great morass on the left, and saw that there was not a bush or twig to hold by. It seemed as if, once blown from our feet, we must be swept out to sea or away into space. There was snow and hail and rain and lightning and thunder, and there were rolling mists travelling with incredible velocity. It was dark, awful, and solitary to the last degree. There were mountains above mountains, veiled in angry clouds, and there was such a wrathful, rapid, violent, tumultuous hurry everywhere as rendered the scene unspeakably exciting and grand. It was a relief to get out of it notwithstanding, and to cross even the dismal, dirty papal frontier. After passing through 2 little towns, in one of which, Acquapendente, there was also a carnival in progress, consisting of 1 man dressed and masked as a woman, and 1 woman dressed and masked as a man, walking ankle-deep through the muddy streets in a very melancholy manner. We came at dusk within sight of the lake of Bolsena, on whose bank there is a little town of the same name, much celebrated for malaria. With the exception of this poor place, there is not a cottage on the bank of the lake, or near it, for nobody dare sleep there. Not a boat upon its water, not a stick or stake to break the dismal monotony of 27 watery miles. We were late in getting in, the roads being very bad from heavy rains, and, after dark, the dullness of the scene was quite intolerable. We entered on a very different and a finer scene of desolation next night at sunset. We had passed through Montefiascione, famous for its wine, and Viterbo for its fountains, and, after climbing up a long hill of 8 or 10 miles extent, came suddenly upon the margin of a solitary lake. In one part very beautiful, with a luxuriant wood, in another very barren, and shut in by bleak volcanic hills. Where this lake flows, there stood of old a city. It was swallowed up one day, and in its stead this water rose. There are ancient traditions, common to many parts of the world, of the ruined city having been seen below when the water was clear, but however that may be, from this spot of earth it vanished. The ground came bubbling up above it, and the water too, and here they stand, like ghosts on whom the other world closed suddenly, and who have no means of getting back again. They seem to be waiting the course of ages for the next earthquake in that place, when they will plunge below the ground at its first yawning and be seen no more. The unhappy city below is not more lost and dreary than these fire-charred hills and the stagnant water above. The red sun looked strangely on them, as with the knowledge that they were made for caverns and darkness, and the melancholy water oozed and sucked the mud, and crept quietly among the marshy grass and reeds, as if the overthrow of all the ancient towers and housetops, and the death of all the ancient people born and bred there, were yet heavy on its conscience. A short ride from this lake brought us to Ronciglione, a little town like a large pigsty, where we passed the night. Next morning, at 7 o'clock, we started for Rome. As soon as we were out of the pigsty, we entered on the Campagna Romana, an undulating flat, as you know, where few people can live, and where, for miles and miles, there is nothing to relieve the terrible monotony and gloom. Of all kinds of country that could, by possibility, lie outside the gates of Rome, this is the aptest and fittest burial ground for the dead city. So sad, so quiet, so sullen, so secret in its covering up of great masses of ruin and hiding them, so like the waste places into which the men possessed with the devil used to go and howl and rend themselves in the old days of Jerusalem. We had to traverse 30 miles of this Campagna, and for 22 we went on, seeing nothing but now and then a lonely house or a villainous-looking shepherd, with matted hair all over his face, and himself wrapped to the chin in a frowsy brown mantle, tending his sheep. At the end of that distance we stopped to refresh the horses and to get some lunch in a common, malaria-shaken, despondent little public house, whose every inch of wall and beam inside was, according to custom, painted and decorated in a way so miserable that every room looked like the wrong side of another room, and, with its wretched imitation of drapery and lopsided little daubs of lyres, seemed to have been plundered from behind the scenes of some travelling circus. When we were fairly going off again, we began, in perfect fever, to strain our eyes for Rome, and when, after another mile or two, the eternal city appeared at length in the distance, it looked like, I am half afraid to write the word, like London. There it lay, under a thick cloud, with innumerable towers and steeples and roofs of houses rising up into the sky, and high above them all one dome. I swear that keenly as I felt the seeming absurdity of the comparison, it was so like London at that distance that if you could have shown it me in a glass, I would have taken it for nothing else. Rome. We entered the Eternal City at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 30th of January by the Porta del Popolo, and came immediately, it was a dark, muddy day, and there had been heavy rain, on the skirts of the Carnival. We did not then know that we were only looking at the fag end of the masks, who were driving slowly round and round the piazza until they could find a promising opportunity for falling into the stream of carriages and getting, in good time, into the thick of the festivity. And coming among them so abruptly, all travel-stained and weary, was not coming very well prepared to enjoy the scene. We had crossed the Tiber by the Ponte Molle 2 or 3 miles before. It had looked as yellow as it ought to look, and hurrying on between its worn-away and murky banks had a promising aspect of desolation and ruin. The masquerade dresses on the fringe of the carnival did great violence to this promise. There were no great ruins, no solemn tokens of antiquity to be seen. They all lie on the other side of the city. There seemed to be long streets of commonplace shops and houses such as are to be found in any European town. There were busy people, equipages, ordinary walkers to and fro, a multitude of chattering strangers. It was no more my Rome, the Rome of anybody's fancy, man or boy, degraded and falling and lying asleep in the sun among a heap of ruins, than the Place de la Concorde in Paris is. A cloudy sky, a dull, cold rain, and muddy streets I was prepared for, but not for this, and I confess to having gone to bed that night in a very indifferent humour, and with a very considerably quenched enthusiasm. Immediately on going out next day, we hurried off to St. Peter's. It looked immense in the distance, but distinctly and decidedly small by comparison on a near approach. The beauty of the piazza on which it stands, with its clusters of exquisite columns and its gushing fountains, so fresh, so broad and free and beautiful, nothing can exaggerate. The first burst of the interior in all its expansive majesty and glory, and, most of all, the looking up into the dome, is a sensation never to be forgotten. But there were preparations for a festa. The pillars of stately marble were swathed in some impertinent frippery of red and yellow. The altar and entrance to the subterranean chapel, which is before it, in the centre of the church, were like a goldsmith's shop, or one of the opening scenes in a very lavish pantomime. And though I had as high a sense of the beauty of the building, I hope, as it is possible to entertain, I felt no very strong emotion. I have been infinitely more affected in many English cathedrals when the organ has been playing, and in many English country churches when the congregation have been singing. I had a much greater sense of mystery and wonder in the Cathedral of St. Mark at Venice. When we came out of the church again, we stood nearly an hour staring up into the dome, and would not have gone over the cathedral then for any money. We said to the coachman, "Go to the Colosseum." In a quarter of an hour or so he stopped at the gate, and we went in. It is no fiction, but plain, sober, honest truth to say, so suggestive and distinct is it at this hour, that, for a moment, actually in passing in, they who will may have the whole great pile before them, as it used to be, with thousands of eager faces staring down into the arena, and such a whirl of strife and blood and dust going on there as no language can describe. Its solitude, its awful beauty, and its utter desolation strike upon the stranger the next moment like a softened sorrow. And never in his life, perhaps, will he be so moved and overcome by any sight not immediately connected with his own affections and afflictions. To see it crumbling there an inch a year, its walls and arches overgrown with green, its corridors open to the day, the long grass growing in porches, young trees of yesterday springing up on its ragged parapets and bearing fruit, chance produce of the seeds dropped there by birds who built their nests within its chinks and crannies, to see its pit of flight filled up with earth, and the peaceful cross planted in the centre. To climb into its upper holes, and look down on ruin, ruin, ruin all about it. The triumphal arches of Constantine, Septimus Severus, and Titus, the Roman Forum, the palace of the Caesars, the temples of the old religion fallen down and gone, is to see the ghost of old Rome, wicked, wonderful old city, haunting the very ground on which its people trod. It is the most impressive, the most stately, the most solemn, grand, majestic, mournful sight conceivable. Never, in its bloodiest prime, can the sight of the gigantic Colosseum, full and running over with the lustiest life, have moved one's heart, as it must move all who look upon it now, a ruin. God be thanked, a ruin. As it tops the other ruins, standing there, a mountain among graves, so do its ancient influences outlive all other remnants of the old mythology and old butchery of Rome, in the nature of the fierce and cruel Roman people. The Italian face changes as the visitor approaches the city. Its beauty becomes devilish, and there is scarcely one countenance in 100 among the common people in the streets that would not be at home and happy in a renovated Colosseum tomorrow. Here was Rome indeed at last, and such a Rome as no one can imagine in its full and awful grandeur. We wandered out upon the Appian Way, and then we went on through miles of ruined tombs and broken walls, with here and there a desolate and inhabited house, past the circus of Romulus, where the course of the chariots, the stations of the judges, competitors, and spectators are yet as plainly to be seen as in old time, past the tomb of Cecilia Metella, past all enclosure, hedge, or stake, wall, or fence, away upon the open Campagna, where, on that side of Rome, nothing is to be held but ruin. Except where the distant Apennines bound the view upon the left, the whole wide prospect is one field of ruin. Broken aqueducts, left in the most picturesque and beautiful clusters of arches, broken temples, broken tombs. A desert of decay, sombre and desolate beyond all expression, and with a history in every stone that strews the ground. On Sunday, the Pope assisted in the performance of High Mass at St. Peter's. The effect of the cathedral on my mind on that second visit was exactly what it was at first, and what it remained after many visits. It is not religiously impressive or affecting. It is an immense edifice with no one point for the mind to rest upon, and it tires itself with wandering round and round. The very purpose of the place is not expressed in anything you see there unless you examine its details, and all examination of details is incomprehensible with the place itself. It might be a pantheon, or a senate house, or a great architectural trophy, having no other object than an architectural triumph. There is a black statue of St. Peter, to be sure, under a red canopy, which is larger than life, and which is constantly having its great toe kissed by good Catholics. You cannot help seeing that. It is so very prominent and popular. But it does not heighten the effect of the temple as a work of art, and it is not expressive, to me at least, of its high purpose. A large space behind the altar was fitted up with boxes shaped like those at the Italian Opera in England, but their decoration much more gaudy. In the centre of the kind of theatre thus railed off was a canopied dais with the Pope's chair upon it. The pavement was covered with a carpet of the brightest green, and what with this green, and the intolerable reds and crimsons and gold borders of the hangings, the whole concern looked like a stupendous bonbon. On either side of the altar was a large box for lady strangers. These were filled with ladies in black dresses and black veils. The gentlemen of the Pope's guard, in red coats, leather breeches, and jack boots, guarded all this reserved space with drawn swords that were very flashy in every sense. And from the altar all down the nave, a broad lane was kept clear by the Pope's Swiss guard, who wear a quaint striped surcoat and striped tight legs, and carry halberds, like those which are usually shouldered by those theatrical supernumeraries who never can get off the stage fast enough, and who may be generally observed to linger in the enemy's camp after the open country, held by the opposite forces, has been split up the middle by a convulsion of nature. I got upon the border of the green carpet, in company with a great many other gentlemen attired in black. No other passport is necessary, and stood there at my ease during the performance of Mass. The singers were in a crib of wirework, like a large meat-safe or bird-cage, in one corner, and sang most atrociously. All about the green carpet there was a slowly moving crowd of people, talking to each other, staring at the Pope through eyeglasses, defrauding one another in moments of partial curiosity out of precarious seats on the bases of pillars, and grinning hideously at the ladies. Dotted here and there were little knots of friars, Franciscani or Cappuccini, in their coarse brown dresses and peaked hoods, making a strange contrast to the gaudy ecclesiastics of higher degree, and having their humility gratified to the utmost by being shouldered about and elbowed right and left on all sides. Some of these had muddy sandals and umbrellas, and stained garments, having trudged in from the country. Their faces of the greater part were as coarse and heavy as their dress. Their dogged, stupid, monotonous stare at all the glory and splendour having something in it half miserable and half ridiculous. Upon the green carpet itself, and gathered round the altar, was a perfect army of cardinals and priests, in red, gold, purple, violet, white, and fine linen. Stragglers from these went to and fro among the crowd, conversing two and two, or giving and receiving introductions, and exchanging salutations. Other functionaries in black gowns, and other functionaries in court dresses, were similarly engaged. In the midst of all these, unstealthy Jesuits creeping in and out, and the extreme restlessness of the youth of England, who were perpetually wandering about, some few steady persons in black cassocks, who had knelt down with their faces to the wall, and were poring over their missals, became unintentionally a sort of humane man-traps, and, with their own devout legs, tripped up other people's by the dozen. There was a great pile of candles lying down on the floor near me, which a very old man in a rusty black gown with an open-work tippet like a summer ornament for a fireplace and tissue paper made himself very busy in dispensing to all the ecclesiastics, one apiece. They loitered about these for some time, under their arms like walking sticks or in their hands like truncheons. At a certain period of the ceremony, however, each carried his candle up to the Pope, laid it across his 2 knees to be blessed, took it back again, and filed off. This was done in a very attenuated procession, as you may suppose, and occupied a long time. Not because it takes long to bless a candle through and through, but because there were so many candles to be blessed. At last they were all blessed, and then they were all lighted, and then the Pope was taken up, chair and all, and carried round the church. I must say that I never saw anything out of November so like the popular English commemoration of the 5th of that month. A bundle of matches and a lantern would have made it perfect. Nor did the Pope himself at all mar the resemblance, though he had a pleasant and venerable face, for, as this part of the ceremony makes him giddy and sick, he shuts his eyes when it is performed. And having his eyes shut, and a great mitre on his head, and his head itself wagging to and fro as they shook him in carrying, he looked as if his mask was going to tumble off. The 2 immense fans which are always borne, one on either side of him, accompanied him of course on this occasion. As they carried him along, he blessed the people with the mystic sign, and, as he passed them, they kneeled down. When he had made the rounds of the church, he was brought back again, and, if I am not mistaken, this performance was repeated in the whole 3 times. There was, certainly, nothing solemn or effective in it, and certainly very much that was droll and tawdry. But this remark applies to the whole ceremony, except the rising of the host, when every man in the guard dropped on one knee instantly, and dashed his naked sword on the ground, which had a fine effect. The next time I saw the cathedral was some 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, when I climbed up into the ball. And then, the hangings being taken down, and the carpets taken up, but all the framework left, the remnants of these decorations looked like an exploded cracker. The Friday and Saturday have been solemn festa days, and Sunday, being always a dies non in carnival proceedings, we had looked forward with some impatience and curiosity to the beginning of the new week, Monday and Tuesday being the 2 last and best days of the carnival. On the Monday afternoon, at 1 or 2 o'clock, there began to be a great rattling of carriages into the courtyard of the hotel, a hurrying to and fro of all the servants in it, and, now and then, a swift shooting across some doorway or balcony, or a straggling stranger in a fancy dress, not yet sufficiently well used to the same to wear it with confidence and defy public opinion. All the carriages were open, and had the linings carefully covered with white cotton or calico, to prevent their proper decorations from being spoilt by the incessant pelting of sugar plums. And people were packing and cramming into every vehicle as it waited for its occupants, enormous sacks and baskets full of these confetti, together with such heaps of flowers, tied up in little nosegays, that some carriages were not only brimful of flowers, but literally running over, scattering at every shake and jerk of the springs some of their abundance on the ground. Not to be behindhand in these essential particulars, we caused 2 very respectable sacks of sugar plums, each about 3 feet high, and a large closed basket full of flowers to be conveyed into our hired barouche with all speed. And from our place of observation in one of the upper balconies of the hotel, we contemplated these arrangements with the liveliest satisfaction. The carriages now beginning to take up their company and move away, we got into ours and drove off too, armed with little wire masks for our faces, the sugar plums, like Falstaff's adulterated sack, having lime in their composition. The Corso is a street a mile long, a street of shops and palaces and private houses, sometimes opening into a broad piazza. There are verandas and balconies of all shapes and sizes to almost every house, not on one story alone, but often to one room or another on every story, put there in general with so little order or regularity that if, year after year, and season after season, it had rained balconies, hailed balconies, snowed balconies, blown balconies, they could scarcely have come into existence in a more disorderly manner. This is the great fountainhead and focus of the carnival. But all the streets in which the carnival is held, being vigilantly kept by dragoons, it is necessary for carriages, in the first instance, to pass, in line, down another thoroughfare, and so come into the Corso at the end remote of the Piazza del Popolo, which is one of its terminations. Accordingly, we fell into the string of coaches and, for some time, jogged on quietly enough, now crawling on a very slow walk, now trotting 6 yards, now back in 50, and now stopping altogether, as the pressure in front obliged us. If any impetuous carriage dashed out of the rank and clattered forward with the wild idea of getting on faster, it was suddenly met or overtaken by a trooper on horseback who, deaf as his own drawn sword to all remonstrances, immediately escorted it back to the very end of the row and made it a dim speck in the remotest perspective. Occasionally we interchanged a volley of confetti with the carriage next in front, or the carriage next behind, but as yet this capturing of stray and errant coaches by the military was the chief amusement. Presently we came into a narrow street where, besides one line of carriages going, there was another line of carriages returning. Here the sugar plums and the nosegays began to fly about pretty smartly, and I was fortunate enough to observe one gentleman attired as a Greek warrior catch a light-whiskered brigand on the nose. He was in the very act of tossing up a bouquet to a young lady in a first-floor window, with a precision that was much applauded by the bystanders. As this victorious Greek was exchanging a facetious remark with a stout gentleman in a doorway, one half black and one half white, as if he had been peeled up the middle, who had offered him his congratulations on this achievement, he received an orange from a housetop full on his left ear, and was much surprised, not to say discomfited, especially as he was standing up at the time, and in consequence of the carriage moving on suddenly, at the same moment staggered ignominiously and buried himself among his flowers. Some quarter of an hour of this sort of progress brought us to the Corso, and anything so gay, so bright and lively as the whole scene there, it would be difficult to imagine. From all the innumerable balconies, from the remotest and highest, no less than from the lowest and nearest, hangings of bright red, bright green, bright blue, white and gold were fluttering in the brilliant sunlight. From windows and from parapets and tops of houses, streamers of the richest colours and draperies of the gaudiest and most sparkling hues were floating out upon the street. The buildings seemed to have been literally turned inside out and to have all their gaiety towards the highway. Shop fronts were taken down, and the windows filled with company, like boxes at a shining theatre. Doors were carried off their hinges, and long tapestried groves, hung with garlands of flowers and evergreens displayed within. Builders' scaffoldings were gorgeous temples, radiant in silver, gold, and crimson. And in every nook and corner, from the pavement to the chimney-tops, where women's eyes could glisten, there they danced and laughed and sparkled like the light in water. Every sort of bewitching madness of dress was there. Little preposterous scarlet jackets, quaint old stomachers, more wicked than the smartest bodices, Polish pelisses, strained and tight as ripe gooseberries, tiny Greek caps, all awry and clinging to the dark hair, heaven knows how. Every wild, quaint, bold, shy, pettish, madcap fancy had its illustration in a dress, and every fancy was as dead forgotten by its owner in the tumult of merriment, as if the 3 old aqueducts that still remain entire had brought Lethe into Rome upon their sturdy arches that morning. The carriages were now 3 abreast, in broader places 4, often stationary for a long time together, always one close mass of variegated brightness, showing the whole street full through the storm of flowers like flowers of a larger growth themselves. In some, the horses were richly caparisoned in magnificent trappings. In others, they were decked from head to tail with flowing ribbons. Some were driven by coachmen with enormous double faces, one face leering at the horses, the other cocking its extraordinary eyes into the carriage, and both rattling again under the hail of sugar plums. Other drivers were attired as women, wearing long ringlets and no bonnets, and looking more ridiculous in any real difficulty with the horses, of which in such a concourse there were great many, than tongues can tell or pen describe. Instead of sitting in the carriages upon the seats, the handsome Roman women, to see and to be seen the better, sit in the heads of the barouches at this time of general licence, with their feet upon the cushion, and oh, the flowing skirts and dainty waists, the blessed shapes and laughing faces, the free, good-humoured, gallant figures that they make. There were great vans, too, full of handsome girls, 30 or more together perhaps, and the broad sides that were poured into and poured out of these fairy fire shops splashed the air with flowers and bonbons for 10 minutes at a time. Carriages, delayed long in one place, would begin a deliberate engagement with other carriages, or with people at the lower windows, and the spectators at some upper balcony or window, joining in the fray and attacking both parties, would empty down great bags of confetti that descended like a cloud, and in an instant made them white as millers. Still, carriages on carriages, dresses on dresses, colours on colours, crowds upon crowds without end. Men and boys clinging to the wheels of coaches, and holding on behind, and following in their wake, and driving in among the horses' feet to pick up scattered flowers to sell again. Maskers on foot, the drollest generally, in fantastic exaggeration of court dresses, surveying the throng through enormous eyeglasses, and always transported with an ecstasy of love on the discovery of any particular old lady at a window, long strings of polichinelli lying about them with blown bladders at the end of sticks, a wagon full of madmen screaming and tearing to the life, a coach full of grave Mamelukes with their horse-tail standards set up in the midst, a party of gypsy women engaged in terrific conflict with a ship full of sailors, a man-monkey on a pole, surrounded by strange animals with pigs' faces and lions' tails, carried under their arms or worn gracefully over their shoulders. Carriages on carriages, dresses on dresses, colours on colours, crowds upon crowds without end. Not many actual characters sustained, or represented, perhaps, considering the number dressed, but the main pleasure of the scene consisting in its perfect good temper, in its bright and infinite and flashing variety, and in its entire abandonment to the mad humour of the time, an abandonment so perfect, so contagious, so irresistible, that the steadiest foreigner fights up to his middle in flowers and sugar plums like the wildest Roman of them all, and thinks of nothing else till 4:30 o'clock, when he is suddenly reminded, to his great regret, that this is not the whole business of his existence, by hearing the trumpets sound, and seeing the dragoons begin to clear the street. How it ever is cleared for the race that takes place at 5, or how the horses ever go through the race without going over the people, is more than I can say. But the carriages get out into the by-street, or up into the Piazza del Popolo, and some people sit in temporary galleries in the latter place, and tens of thousands line the corso on both sides, when the horses are brought out into the piazza, to the foot of the same column which, for centuries, looked down upon the games and chariot races in the Circus Maximus. At a given signal they are started off. Down the live lane, the whole length of the Corso, they fly like the wind, riderless, as all the world knows, with shining ornaments upon their backs, untwisted in their plaited manes, and with heavy little balls stuck full of spikes, dangling at their sides to goad them on. The jingling of these trappings and the rattling of their hoofs upon the hard stones, the dash and fury of their speed along the echoing streets, nay, the very cannon that are fired, these noises are nothing to the roaring of the multitude, their shouts, the clapping of their hands. But it is soon over, almost instantaneously. More cannons shake the town. The horses have plunged into the carpets put across the street to stop them. The goal is reached. The prizes are won. They are given, in part, by the poor Jews as a compromise for not running foot races themselves. And there is an end to that day's sport. But if the scene be bright and gay and crowded on the last day but one, it attains on the concluding day to such a height of glittering colour, swarming life, and frolicsome uproar, that the bare recollection of it makes me giddy at this moment. The same diversions, greatly heightened and intensified in the ardour with which they are pursued, go on until the same hour. The race is repeated, the cannon are fired, the shouting and clapping of hands are renewed, the cannon are fired again, the race is over, and the prizes are won. But the carriages, ankle deep with sugar plums within, and so beflowered and dusty without, as to be hardly recognizable for the same vehicles that they were 3 hours ago, instead of scampering off in all directions, throng into the Corso, where they are soon wedged together in a scarcely moving mass. For the diversion of the Moccoletti, the last gay madness of the carnival, is now at hand, and sellers of little tapers, like what are called Christmas candles in England, are shouting lustily on every side, "Mocolli! Mocolli! Ecco Mocolli!" A new item in the tumult, quite abolishing that other item of "Ecco fiori! Ecco fior!" which has been making itself audible over all the rest at intervals the whole day through. As the bright hangings and dresses are all fading into one dull, heavy, uniform colour in the decline of the day, lights begin flashing here and there, in the windows, on the housetops, in the balconies, in the carriages, in the hands of the foot passengers, little by little, gradually, more and more, until the whole long street is one great glare and blaze of fire. Then everybody present has but one engrossing object, that is, to extinguish other people's candles and to keep his own alight. And everybody, man, woman, or child, gentleman or lady, prince or peasant, native or foreigner, yells and screams and roars incessantly as a taunt to the subdued, "Senza moccolo! Senza moccolo!" Without a light! Without a light! Until nothing is heard but a gigantic chorus of those two words, mingled with peals of laughter. The spectacle, at this time, is one of the most extraordinary that can be imagined. Carriages coming slowly by, with everybody standing on the seats or on the box, holding up their lights at arm's length for greater safety, some in paper shades, some with a bunch of undefended little tapers kindled together, some with blazing torches, some with feeble little candles, men on foot, creeping along among the wheels, watching their opportunity to make a spring at some particular light and dash it out. Other people climbing up into carriages to get hold of them by main force. Others chasing some unlucky wanderer round and round his own coach to blow out the light he has begged or stolen somewhere before he can ascend to his own company, and enable them to light their extinguished tapers. Others, with their hats off, at a carriage door, humbly beseeching some kind-hearted lady to oblige them with a light for a cigar, and when she is in the fullness of doubt whether to comply or no, blowing out the candle she has guarded so tenderly with her little hand. Other people at the windows, fishing for candles with lines and hooks, or letting down long willow wands with handkerchiefs at the end, and flapping them out dexterously when the bearer is at the height of his triumph. Others bidding their time in corners, with immense extinguishers like halberds, and suddenly coming down upon glorious torches. Others gathered round one coach and sticking to it. Others raining oranges and nosegays at an obdurate little lantern, or regularly storming a pyramid of men, holding up one man among them, who carries one feeble little wick above his head, with which he defies them all. Senza moccolo! Senza moccolo! Beautiful women standing up in coaches, pointing in derision at extinguished lights, and clapping their hands as they pass on, crying, Senza moccolo! Senza moccolo! Low balconies full of lovely faces and gay dresses, struggling with assailants in the streets, some repressing them as they climb up, some bending down, some leaning over, some shrinking back, delicate arms and bosoms, graceful figures, glowing lights, fluttering dresses, senza moccolo, senza moccoli, senza moccolo. When the wildest enthusiasm of the cry and fullest ecstasy of the sport, the Ave Maria rings from the church steeples, and the carnival is over in an instant, put out like a taper, with a breath. There was a masquerade at the theatre at night, as dull and senseless as the London one, and only remarkable for the summary way in which the house was cleared at 11 o'clock, which was done by a line of soldiers forming along the wall at the back of the stage and sweeping the whole company out before them like a broad broom. The game of the moccoletti, the word in the singular moccoletto, is the diminutive of moccolo, and means a little lamp or candle snuff, is supposed by some to be a ceremony of burlesque mourning for the death of the carnival, candles being indispensable to Catholic grief. But whether it be so, or be a remnant of the ancient Saturnalia, or an incorporation of both, or have its origin in anything else, I shall always remember it and the frolic as a brilliant and most captivating sight. No less remarkable for the unbroken good humour of all concerned, down to the very lowest, and among those who scaled the carriages were many of the commonest men and boys, than for its innocent vivacity. For, odd as it may seem to say so, of a sport so full of thoughtlessness and personal display, it is as free from any taint of immodesty as any general mingling of the two sexes can possibly be, and there seems to prevail during its progress a feeling of general, almost childish, simplicity and confidence which one thinks of with a pang, when the Ave Maria has wrung it away for a whole year. Availing ourselves of a part of the quiet interval between the termination of the carnival and the beginning of the Holy Week, when everybody had run away from the one and few people had yet begun to run back again for the other, we went conscientiously to work to see Rome. And, by dint of going out early every morning and coming back late every evening, and labouring hard all day, I believe we made acquaintance with every post and pillar in the city and the country round, and, in particular, explored so many churches that I abandoned that part of the enterprise at last before it was half finished, lest I should never, of my own accord, go to church again as long as I lived. But I managed almost every day, at one time or other, to get back to the Colosseum and out upon the open Campagna beyond the tomb of Cecilia Metella. We often encountered in these expeditions a company of English tourists with whom I had an ardent but ungratified longing to establish a speaking acquaintance. They were one Mr. Davis and a small circle of friends. It was impossible not to know Mrs. Davis's name, from her being always in great request among her party, and her party being everywhere. During the Holy Week they were in every part of every scene of every ceremony. For a fortnight or 3 before it, they were in every tomb, in every church, and every ruin, and every picture gallery, and I hardly ever observed Mrs. Davis to be silent for a moment. Deep underground, high up in St. Peter's, out on the Campagna, and stifling in the Jews' quarters, Mrs. Davis turned up all the same. I don't think she ever saw anything, or ever looked at anything. And she had always lost something out of a straw-hand basket, and was trying to find it with all her might and main, among an immense quantity of English halfpenny which lay like sand upon the seashore at the bottom of it. There was a professional cicerone attached to the party, which had been brought over from London 15 or 20 strong by contract, and if he so much as looked at Mrs. Davis, she invariably cut him short by saying, "There, God bless the man, don't worrit me. I don't understand a word you say, and shouldn't if you was to talk till you was black in the face." Mr. Davis always had a snuff-coloured great coat on, and carried a great green umbrella in his hand, and had a slow curiosity constantly devouring him, which prompted him to do extraordinary things, such as taking the covers off urns in tombs, and looking in at the ashes as if they were pickles, and tracing out inscriptions with the ferrule of his umbrella, and saying with intense thoughtfulness, "Here's a B, you see, and there's a R, and this is the way we go on in, is it?" His antiquarian habits occasioned his being frequently in the rear of the rest, and one of the agonies of Mrs. Davis and the party in general was an ever-present fear that Davis would be lost. This caused them to scream for him in the strangest places and at the most improper seasons. And when he came, slowly emerging out of some sepulchre or other, like a peaceful ghoul, saying, "Here I am," Mrs. Davis invariably replied, "You'll be buried alive in a foreign country, Davis, and it's no use trying to prevent you." Mr. and Mrs. Davis and their party had, probably, been brought from London in about 9 or 10 days. 1800 years ago, the Roman legions under Claudius protested against being led into Mr. and Mrs. Davis's country, urging that it lay beyond the limits of the world. Among what may be called the cubs or minor lions of Rome, there was one that amused me mightily. It is always to be found there, and its den is on the great flight of steps that lead from the Piazza di Spagna to the Church of Trinità del Monte. In plainer words, these steps are the great place of resort for the artist's models, and there they are constantly waiting to be hired. The first time I went there, I could not conceive why the faces seemed familiar to me, why they appeared to have beset me for years in every possible variety of action and costume, and how it came to pass that they started up before me in Rome in the broad day like so many saddled and bridled nightmares. I soon found that we had made acquaintance and improved it for several years on the walls of various exhibition galleries. There is one old gentleman with long white hair and an immense beard who, to my knowledge, has gone half through the catalogue of the Royal Academy. This is the venerable or patriarchal model. He carries a long staff, and every knot and twist that staff I have seen faithfully delineated innumerable times. There is another man in a blue cloak, who always pretends to be asleep in the sun, when there is any, and who, I need not say, is always very wide awake, and very attentive to the disposition of his legs. This is the dolce far niente model. There is another man in a brown cloak, who leans against a wall, with his arms folded in his mantle, and looks out of the corner of his eyes, which are just visible beneath his broad slouched hat. This is the assassin model. There is another man who constantly looks over his own shoulder, and is always going away, but never does. This is the haughty or scornful model. As to domestic happiness and holy families, they should come very cheap, for there are lumps of them, all up the steps, and the cream of the thing is that they are all the falsest vagabonds in the world, especially made up for the purpose, and having no counterparts in Rome or any other part of the habitable globe. My recent mention of the carnival reminds me of it being said to be a mock mourning in the ceremony with which it closes, for the gaieties and merry-makings before Lent. And this again reminds me of the real funerals and mourning processions of Rome, which, like those in most other parts of Italy, are rendered chiefly remarkable to the foreigner by the indifference with which the mere clay is universally regarded after life has left it. And this is not from the survivors having had time to dissociate the memory of the dead from their well-remembered appearance and form on earth, for the interment follows too speedily after death for that, almost always taking place within 24 hours, and sometimes within 12. At Rome there is the same arrangement of pits in a great, bleak, open, dreary space that I have already described as existing in Genoa. When I visited it at noonday, I saw a solitary coffin of plain deal, uncovered by any shroud or pall, and so slightly made that the hoof of any wandering mule would have crushed it in, carelessly tumbled down all on one side on the door of one of the pits, and there left by itself in the wind and sunshine. "How does it come to be left here?" I asked the man who showed me the place. "It was brought here half an hour ago, signore," he said. I remembered to have met the procession on its return, straggling away at a good round pace. "When will it be put in the pit?" I asked him. "When the cart comes, and it is opened tonight," he said. "How much does it cost to be brought here in this way instead of coming in the cart?" I asked him. 10 scudi, he said. About £2, 2 and sixpence English. "The other bodies, for whom nothing is paid, are taken to the church of the Santa Maria della Consolazione," he continued, "and brought here all together in the cart at night." I stood a moment looking at the coffin, which had 2 initial letters scrawled upon the top, and turned away with an expression in my face, I suppose, of not much liking its exposure in that manner. For he said, shrugging his shoulders with great vivacity, and giving a pleasant smile, "But he's dead, signore, he's dead. Why not?" Among the innumerable churches, there is one I must select for separate mention. It is the church of the Aracoeli, supposed to be built on the site of the old temple of Jupiter Feretrius, and approached on one side by a long steep flight of steps, which seems incomplete without some group of bearded soothsayers on the top. It is remarkable for the possession of a miraculous bambino, or wooden doll, representing the infant Saviour. And I first saw this miraculous bambino in legal phrase in manner following, that is to say. We had strolled into the church one afternoon, and were looking down its long vista of gloomy pillars, for all these ancient churches built upon the ruins of old temples are dark and sad, when the brave came running in, with a grin upon his face that stretched it from ear to ear, and implored us to follow him without a moment's delay, as they were going to show the bambino to a select party. We accordingly hurried off to a sort of chapel, or sacristy, hard by the chief altar, but not in the church itself, where the select party, consisting of 2 or 3 Catholic gentlemen and ladies, not Italians, were already assembled, and where one hollow-cheeked young monk was lighting up divers candles, while another was putting on some clerical robes over his coarse brown habit. The candles were on a kind of altar, and above it 2 delectable figures, such as you would see at any English fair, representing the Holy Virgin and Saint Joseph, as I suppose, bending in devotion over a wooden box or coffer which was shut. The hollow-cheeked monk, number 1, having finished lighting the candles, went down on his knees in a corner before the set piece, and The monk number 2, having put on a pair of highly ornamented and gold-bespattered gloves, lifted down the coffer with great reverence and set it on the altar. Then, with many genuflections and muttering certain prayers, he opened it and let down the front and took off sundry coverings of satin and lace from the inside. The ladies had been on their knees from the commencement, and the gentleman now dropped down devoutly as he exposed to view a little wooden doll, in face very like General Tom Thumb, the American dwarf, gorgeously dressed in satin and gold lace, and actually blazing with rich jewels. There was scarcely a spot upon its little breast, or neck, or stomach, but was sparkling with the costly offerings of the faithful. Presently he lifted it out of the box, and carrying it round among the kneelers, set its face against the forehead of everyone, and tendered its clumsy foot to them to kiss, a ceremony which they all performed down to a dirty little ragamuffin of a boy who had walked in from the street. When this was done, he laid it in the box again, and the company, rising, drew near and commended the jewels in whispers. In good time he replaced the coverings, shut up the box, put it back in its place, and locked the whole concern, Holy Family and all, behind a pair of folding doors, took off his priestly vestments, and received the customary small charge, which his companion, by means of an extinguisher fastened to the end of a long stick, put out the lights one after another. The candles being all extinguished, and the money all collected, they retired, and so did the spectators. I met this same bambino in the street a short time afterwards, going, in great state, to the house of some sick person. It is taken to all parts of Rome for this purpose constantly, but I understand that it is not always as successful as could be wished, for, making its appearance at the bedside of weak and nervous people in extremity, accompanied by a numerous escort, it not unfrequently frightens them to death. It is most popular in cases of childbirth, where it has done such wonders that, if a lady be longer than usual in getting through her difficulties, a messenger is dispatched with all speed to solicit the immediate attendance of the bambino. It is a very valuable property and much confided in, especially by the religious body to whom it belongs. I am happy to know that it is not considered immaculate by some who are good Catholics, and who are behind the scenes, from what was told me by the near relation of a priest, himself a Catholic, and a gentleman of learning and intelligence. This priest made my informant promise that he would, on no account, allow the bambino to be borne into the bedroom of a sick lady, in whom they were both interested. For, said he, if they, the monks, trouble her with it, and intrude themselves into her room, it will certainly kill her. My informant accordingly looked out the window when it came, and, with many thanks, declined to open the door. He endeavoured, in another case of which he had no other knowledge than such as he gained as a passer-by at the moment, to prevent its being carried into a small unwholesome chamber where a poor girl was dying. But he strove against it unsuccessfully, and she expired while the crowd were pressing round her bed. Among the people who drop into St. Peter's at their leisure to kneel on the pavement and say a quiet prayer, there are certain schools and seminaries, priestly and otherwise, that come in 20 or 30 strong. These boys always kneel down in single file, one behind the other, with a tall grim master in a black gown bringing up the rear, like a pack of cards arranged to be tumbled down at a touch, with a disproportionately large knave of clubs at the end. When they have had a minute or so at the chief altar, they scramble up, and filing off to the chapel of the Madonna or the sacrament, flop down again in the same order, so that if anybody did stumble against the master, a general and sudden overthrow of the whole line must inevitably ensue. The scene in all the churches is the strangest possible. The same monotonous, heartless, drowsy chaunting, always going on. The same dark building, darker from the brightness of the street without. The same lamp dimly burning, the self-same people kneeling here and there, turned towards you from one altar or another, the same priest's back, with the same large cross embroidered on it, however different in size, in shape, in wealth, in architecture, this church is from that, it is the same thing still. There are the same dirty beggars stopping in the muttered prayers to beg, the same miserable cripples exhibiting their deformity at the doors, the same blind men rattling little pots like kitchen pepper castors, their depositories for alms, the same preposterous crowns of silver stuck upon the painted heads of single saints and virgins in crowded pictures, so that a little figure on a mountain has a head dress bigger than the temple in the foreground or at adjacent miles of landscape. The same favourite shrine of figure, smothered with little silver hearts and crosses and the like. The staple trade and show of all the jewellers. The same odd mixture of respect and indecorum, faith and phlegm, kneeling on the stones and spitting on them loudly, getting up from prayers to beg a little, or to pursue some other worldly matter, and then kneeling down again to resume the contrite supplication at the point where it was interrupted. In one church, a kneeling lady got up from her prayer for a moment to offer us her card as a teacher of music, and in another, a sedate gentleman with a very thick walking staff arose from his devotions to belabour his dog, who was growling at another dog, and whose yelps and howls resounded through the church, as his master quietly relapsed into his former train of meditation, keeping his eye upon the dog at the same time nevertheless. Above all, there is always a receptacle for the contribution of the faithful, in some form or other. Sometimes it is a money box set up between the worshipper and the wooden life-size figure of the Redeemer. Sometimes it is a little chest for the maintenance of the Virgin. Sometimes an appeal on behalf of a popular bambino, sometimes a bag at the end of a long stick, thrust among the people here and there, and vigilantly jingled by an active sacristan. But there it always is, and very often, in many shapes in the same church, and doing pretty well in all. Nor is it wanton in the open air, the streets and roads, for, often as you are walking along, thinking about anything rather than a tin canister, that object pounces out upon you from a little house by the wayside, and on its top is painted, "For the souls in purgatory," an appeal which the bearer repeats a great many times as he rattles it before you, much as Punch rattles the cracked bell which his sanguine disposition makes an organ of. And this reminds me that some Roman altars of peculiar sanctity bear the inscription, "Every Mass performed at this altar frees a soul from purgatory." I have never been able to find out the charge for one of these services, but they should need be expensive. There are several crosses in Rome too, the kissing of which confers indulgences for varying terms. That, in the centre of the Colosseum, is worth 100 days, and people may be seen kissing it from morning to night. It is curious that some of these crosses seem to acquire an arbitrary popularity. This very one among them. In another part of the Colosseum there is a cross upon a marble slab with the inscription, "Who kisses this cross shall be entitled to 240 days' indulgence." But I saw no one person kiss it, though, day after day, I sat in the arena and saw scores upon scores of peasants pass it on their way to kiss the other. To single out details from the great dream of Roman churches would be the wildest occupation in the world. But St. Stefano Rotondo, a damp, mildewed vault of an old church in the outskirts of Rome, will always struggle uppermost in my mind by reason of the hideous paintings with which its walls are covered. These represent the martyrdoms of saints and early Christians, and such a panorama of horror and butchery no man could imagine in his sleep, though he were to eat a whole pig raw for supper. Grey-bearded men being boiled, fried, grilled, crimped, singed, eaten by wild beasts, worried by dogs, buried alive, torn asunder by horses, chopped up small with hatchets. Women having their breasts torn with iron pincers, their tongues cut out, their ears screwed off, their jaws broken, their bodies stretched upon the rack, or skinned upon the stake, or crackled up and melted in the fire. These are among the mildest subjects. So insisted on and laboured at besides, that every sufferer gives you the same occasion for wonder as poor old Duncan awoke in Lady Macbeth, when she marvelled at his having so much blood in him. There is an upper chamber in the Mamertine prisons over what is said to have been, and very possibly may have been, the dungeon of St. Peter. This chamber is now fitted up as an oratory, dedicated to that saint, and it lives as a distinct and separate place in my recollection too. It is very small and low-roofed, and the dread and gloom of the ponderous, obdurate old prison are on it, as if they had come up in a dark mist through the floor. Hanging on the walls, among the clustered votive offerings, are objects at once strangely in keeping and strangely at variance with the place. Rusty daggers, knives, pistols, clubs, diverse instruments of violence and murder, brought here fresh from use, and hung up to propitiate offended heaven, as if the blood upon them would drain off in consecrated air, and have no voice to cry with. It is all so silent and so close and tomb-like, and the dungeons below are so black and stealthy and stagnant and naked, that this little dark spot becomes a dream within a dream, and in the vision of great churches which come rolling past me like a sea, it is a small wave by itself that melts into no other wave and does not flow on with the rest. It is an awful thing to think of the enormous caverns that are entered from some Roman churches and undermine the city. Many churches have crypts and subterranean chapels of great size, which, in ancient time, were baths and secret chambers of temples and what not, but I do not speak of them. Beneath the church of San Giovanni and San Paolo there are the jaws of a terrific range of caverns, hewn out of the rock, and said to have another outlet underneath the Colosseum. Tremendous darknesses of vast extent, half buried in the earth and unexplorable, where the dull torches, flashed by the attendants, glimmer down long range of distant vaults bracing to the right and left, like streets in a city of the dead, and show the cold damp stealing down the walls, drip, drop, to join the pools of water that lie here and there, and never saw, or never will see, one ray of the sun. Some accounts make these the prisons of the wild beasts destined for the amphitheatre, some of the prisons of the condemned gladiators, some both. But the legend most appalling to this fancy is, that in the upper range, for there are 2 stories of these caves, the early Christians destined to be eaten at the Colosseum shows heard the wild beasts, hungry for them, roaring down below, until, upon the night and solitude of their captivity, there burst the sudden noon and life of the vast theatre, crowded to the parapet, and of these their dreaded neighbours bounding in. Below the church of San Sebastiano, 2 miles beyond the gate of San Sebastiano on the Appian Way, is the entrance to the catacombs of Rome, quarries in the old time, but afterwards the hiding places of the Christians. These ghastly passages have been explored for 20 miles, and form a chain of labyrinths 60 miles in circumference. A gaunt Franciscan friar with a wild bright eye was our only guide down into this profound and dreadful place. The narrow ways and openings hither and thither, coupled with the dead and heavy air, soon blotted out in all of us any recollection of the track by which we had come. And I could not help thinking, good heaven, if, in a sudden fit of madness, he should dash the torches out, or, if he should be seized with a fit, what would become of us? On we wandered among martyrs' graves, passing great subterranean vaulted roads, diverging in all directions, and choked up with heaps of stones, that thieves and murderers may not take refuge there, and form a population under Rome even worse than that which lives between it and the sun. Graves, 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 graves of men, of women, of their little children, who ran crying to their persecutors, "We are Christians, we are Christians," that they might be murdered with their parents. Graves with the palms of martyrdom roughly cut into their stone boundaries, and little niches, made to hold a vessel of the martyr's blood. Graves of some who lived down here for years together, ministering to the rest, and preaching truth and hope and comfort from the rude altars that bear witness to their fortitude at this hour. More roomy graves, but far more terrible, where hundreds, being surprised, were hemmed in and walled up, buried before death, and killed by slow starvation. "The triumphs of the faith are not above ground in our splendid churches," said the friar, looking round upon us as we stopped to rest in one of the low passages, with bones and dust surrounding us on every side. "They are here, among the martyrs' graves." He was a gentle, earnest man, and said it from his heart. But when I thought how Christian men have dealt with one another, how, perverting our most merciful religion, they have hunted down and tortured, burnt and beheaded, strangled, slaughtered, and oppressed each other, I picture to myself an agony surpassing any that this dust has suffered, with the breath of life yet lingering in it, and how these great and constant hearts would have been shaken, how they would have quailed and drooped, if a foreknowledge of the deeds that professing Christians would commit to the great name for which they died could have rent them with its own unutterable anguish on the cruel wheel and bitter cross, and in the fearful fire. Such are the spots and patches in my dream of churches that remain apart and keep their separate identity. I have a fainter recollection sometimes of the relics, of the fragments of the pillar of the temple that was rent in twine, of the portion of the table that was spread for the Last Supper, of the well at which the woman of Samaria gave water to our Saviour, of the 2 columns from the house of Pontius Pilate, of the stone to which the sacred hands were bound when the scourging was performed, of the grid iron of St. Lawrence, and the stone below it, marked with the frying of his fat and blood. These set a shadowy mark on some cathedrals, as an old story or a fable might, and stop them for an instant as they flit before me. The rest is a vast wilderness of consecrated buildings of all shapes and fancies, blending one with another, of battered pillars of old pagan temples dug up from the ground and forced, like giant captives, to support the roofs of Christian churches, of pictures bad and wonderful, and impious and ridiculous, of kneeling people curling incense, tinkling bells, and sometimes, but not often, of a swelling organ, of Madonna with their breasts stuck full of swords, arranged in a half-circle like a modern fan, of actual skeletons of dead saints, hideously attired in gaudy satins, silks, and velvets trimmed with gold, their withered crusts of skull adorned with precious jewels, or with chaplets of crushed flowers. Sometimes of people gathered round the pulpit, and a monk within it stretching out the crucifix and preaching fiercely, the sun just streaming down through some high window on the sailcloth stretched above him and across the church, to keep his high-pitched voice from being lost among the echoes of the roof. Then my tired memory comes out upon a flight of steps, where knots of people are asleep or basking in the light, and strolls away among the rags and smells and palaces and hovels of an old Italian street. On one Saturday morning, the 8th of March, a man was beheaded here. 9 or 10 months before, he had waylaid a Bavarian countess travelling as a pilgrim to Rome, alone and on foot, of course, and performing, it is said, the act of piety for the 4th time. He saw her change a piece of gold at Viterbo, where he lived, followed her, bore her company on her journey for some 40 miles or more, on the treacherous pretext of protecting her, attacked her in the fulfillment of his unrelented purpose on the Campagna, within a very short distance of Rome, near to what is called, but what is not, the tomb of Nero, robbed her, and beat her to death with her own pilgrim's staff. He was newly married, and gave some of her apparel to his wife, saying that he had bought it at a fair. She, however, who had seen the pilgrim countess passing through their town, recognized some trifle as having belonged to her. Her husband then told her what he had done. She, in confession, told a priest, and the man was taken within 4 days after the commission of the murder. There are no fixed times for the administration of justice or its execution in this unaccountable country, and he had been in prison ever since. On the Friday, as he was dining with the other prisoners, they came and told him he was to be beheaded next morning, and took him away. It is very unusual to execute in Lent, but his crime being a very bad one, it was deemed advisable to make an example of him at that time, when great numbers of pilgrims were coming towards Rome from all parts for the Holy Week. I heard of this on the Friday evening, and saw the bills up at the churches, calling on the people to pray for the criminal's soul. So I determined to go and see him executed. The beheading was appointed for 14:30 o'clock Roman time, or 9:15 in the forenoon. I had 2 friends with me, and, as we did not know but that the crowd might be very great, we were on the spot by 7:30. The place of execution was near the church of San Giovanni de Collato, a doubtful complement to St. John the Baptist, in one of the impassable back streets without any footway, of which a great part of Rome is composed. A street of rotten houses, which do not seem to belong to anybody, and do not seem to have ever been inhabited, and certainly were never built on any plan for any particular purpose, and have no window sashes, and are a little like deserted breweries, and might be warehouses but for having nothing in them. Opposite to one of these, a white house, the scaffold was built. An untidy, unpainted, uncouth, crazy-looking thing, of course. Some 7 feet high, perhaps, with a tall, gallows-shaped frame rising above it, in which was the knife, charged with a ponderous mass of iron, all ready to descend, and glittering brightly in the morning sun whenever it looked out now and then from behind a cloud. There were not many people lingering about, and these were kept at a considerable distance from the scaffold by parties of the Pope's dragoons. 200 or 300-foot soldiers were under arms, standing at ease in clusters here and there, and the officers were walking up and down in 2s and 3s, chatting together and smoking cigars. At the end of the street was an open space where there would be a dust heap and piles of broken crockery and mounds of vegetable refuse, but for such things being thrown anywhere and everywhere in Rome, and favouring no particular sort of locality. We got into a kind of wash-house belonging to a dwelling-house on this spot, and standing there in an old cart, and on a heap of cart-wheels piled against the wall, looked through a large grated window at the scaffold and straight down the street beyond it, until, in consequence of its turning off abruptly to the left, our perspective was brought to a sudden termination, and had a corpulent officer in a cocked hat for its crowning feature. 9 o'clock struck, and 10 o'clock struck, and nothing happened. All the bells of all the churches rang as usual. A little parliament of dogs assembled in the open space, and chased each other in and out among the soldiers. Fierce-looking Romans of the lowest class, in blue cloaks, russet cloaks, and rags uncloaked, came and went and talked together. Women and children fluttered on the skirts of the scanty crowd. One large muddy spot was left quite bare, like a bald place on a man's head. A cigar merchant, with an earthen pot of charcoal ashes in one hand, went up and down crying his wares. A pastry merchant divided his attention between the scaffold and his customers. Boys tried to climb up walls and tumbled down again. Priests and monks elbowed a passage for themselves among the people and stood on tiptoe for a sight of the knife, then went away. Artists in inconceivable hats of the Middle Ages and beards, thank heaven, of no age at all, flashed picturesque scowls about them from their stations in the throng. One gentleman, connected with the fine arts, I presume, went up and down in a pair of Hessian boots, with a red beard hanging down on his breast, and his long and bright red hair plaited in two tails, one on either side of his head, which fell over his shoulders in front of him, very nearly to his waist, and were carefully entwined and braided. 11 o'clock struck, and still nothing happened. A rumour got about among the crowd that the criminal would not confess, in which case the priests would keep in until the Ave Maria sunset, for it is their merciful custom never finally to turn the crucifix away from a man at that pass, as one refusing to be shriven, and consequently a sinner abandoned of the Saviour until then. People began to drop off. The officers shrugged their shoulders and looked doubtful. The dragoons, who came riding up below our window every now and then to order an unlucky hackney coach or cart away as soon as it had comfortably established itself and was covered with exulting people, but never before, became imperious and quick-tempered. The bald place hadn't a straggling hair upon it, and the corpulent officer, crowning the perspective, took a world of snuff. Suddenly there was a noise of trumpets. "Attention!" was among the foot soldiers instantly. They were marched up the scaffold and formed round it. The dragoons galloped to their nearer stations too. The guillotine became the centre of a wood of bristling bayonets and shining sabres. The people closed round nearer on the flank of the soldiery. A long straggling stream of men and boys who had accompanied the procession from the prison came pouring into the open space. The bald spot was scarcely distinguishable from the rest. The cigar and pastry merchants resigned all thoughts of business for the moment, and, abandoning themselves wholly to pleasure, got good situations in the crowd. The perspective ended now in a troop of dragoons, and the corpulent officer, sword in hand, looked hard at the church close to him, which he could see, but we, the crowd, could not. After a short delay, some monks were seen approaching to the scaffold from this church, and above their heads, coming on slowly and gloomily, the effigy of Christ upon the cross, canopied with black. This was carried round the foot of the scaffold to the front, and turned towards the criminal, that he might see it to the last. It was hardly in its place when he appeared on the platform, barefooted, his hands bound, and with the collar and neck of his shirt cut away almost to the shoulder. A young man, 26, vigorously made and well-shaped. Face pale, small dark moustache, and dark brown hair. He had refused to confess, it seemed, without first having his wife brought to see him, and they had sent an escort for her, which had occasioned the delay. He immediately kneeled down below the knife. His neck, fitting into a hole made for the purpose in a cross plank, was shut down by another plank above, exactly like the pillory. Immediately below him was a leathern bag, and into it his head rolled instantly. The executioner was holding it by the hair, and walking with it round the scaffold, showing it to the people, before one quite knew that the knife had fallen heavily, and with a rattling sound. When it had travelled round the four sides of the scaffold, it was set upon a pole in front, a little patch of black and white for the long street to stare at, and the flies to settle on. The eyes were turned upwards, as if he had avoided the sight of the leathern bag, and looked to the crucifix. Every tinge and hue of life had left it in that instant. It was dull, cold, livid, wax. The body also. There was a great deal of blood. When we left the window and went close up to the scaffold, it was very dirty. One of the two men who were throwing water over it, turning to help the other lift the body into a shell, picked his way as through mire. A strange appearance was the apparent annihilation of the neck. The head was taken off so close that it seemed as if the knife had narrowly escaped crushing the jaw or shaving off the ear, and the body looked as if there were nothing left above the shoulder. Nobody cared or was at all affected. There was no manifestation of disgust or pity or indignation or sorrow. My empty pockets were tried several times in the crowd immediately below the scaffold as the corpse was being put into its coffin. It was an ugly, filthy, careless, sickening spectacle, meaning nothing but butchery beyond the momentary interest to the one wretched actor. Yes, such a sight has one meaning and one warning. Let me not forget it. The speculators in the lottery station themselves at favourable points for counting the gouts of blood that spit out here or there and by that number. It is pretty sure to have a run upon it. The body was carted away in due time, the knife cleansed, the scaffold taken down, and all the hideous apparatus removed. The executioner, an outlaw ex officio, what a satire on the punishment, who dare not, for his life, cross the bridge of St. Angelo but to do his work, retreated to his lair, and the show was over. At the head of the collections in the palaces of Rome, the Vatican, of course, with its treasures of art, its enormous galleries and staircases, and suites upon suites of immense chambers, rank highest and stands foremost. Many most noble statues and wonderful pictures are there. Nor is it heresy to say that there is a considerable amount of rubbish there too. When any old piece of sculpture, dug out of the ground, find a place in a gallery because it is old and without any reference to its intrinsic merits, and finds admirers by the hundreds because it is there and for no other reason on earth, there will be no lack of objects very indifferent in the plain eyesight of any one who employs so vulgar a property, when he may wear the spectacles of Kant for less than nothing, and establish himself as a man of taste for the mere trouble of putting them on. I unreservedly confess for myself that I cannot leave my natural perception of what is natural and true at a palace door in Italy or elsewhere, as I shall leave my shoes if I were travelling in the East. I cannot forget that there are certain expressions of face natural to certain passions, and as unchangeable in their nature as the gait of a lion or the flight of an eagle. I cannot dismiss from my certain knowledge such commonplace facts as the ordinary proportion of men's arms and legs and heads. And when I meet with performances that do violence to these experiences and recollections, no matter where they may be, I cannot honestly admire them, and think it best to say so, in spite of high critical advice that we should sometimes feign an admiration, though we have it not. Therefore, I freely acknowledge that when I see a jolly young waterman representing a cherubim, or a Barclay and Perkins drayman depicted as an evangelist, I see nothing to commend or admire in the performance, however great its reputed painter. Neither am I partial to libellous angels who play on fiddles and bassoons for the edification of sprawling monks apparently in liquor, nor to those Monsieur Tonsons of galleries, St. Francis and St. Sebastian, both of whom, I submit, should have very uncommon and rare merits as works of art to justify their compound multiplication by Italian painters. It seems to me, too, that the indiscriminate and determined raptures in which some critics indulge is incompatible with the true appreciation of the really great and transcendent works. I cannot imagine, for example, how the resolute champion of undeserving pictures can soar to an amazing beauty of Titan's great picture of the Assumption of the Virgin at Venice, or how the man who is truly affected by the sublimity of that exquisite production, or who is truly sensible to the beauty of Tintoretto's great picture of the Assembly of the Blessed in the same place, can discern in Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel any general idea or one pervading thought in harmony with the stupendous subject. He who will contemplate Raphael's masterpiece, the Transfiguration, and will go away into another chamber of that same Vatican, and contemplate another design of Raphael, representing, in incredible caricature, the miraculous stopping of a great fire by Leo IV, and who will say that he admires them both as work of extraordinary genius, must, as I think, be wanting in his powers of perception in one of the two instances, and probably in the high and lofty one. It is easy to suggest a doubt, but I have great doubt whether, sometimes, the rules of art are not too strictly observed, and whether it is quite well or agreeable that we should know beforehand where this figure will be turning round, and where that figure will be lying down, and where there will be drapery in folds, and so forth. When I observe heads inferior to the subject in pictures of merit in Italian galleries, I do not attach that reproach to the painter, for I have a suspicion that these great men, who were, of necessity, very much in the hands of monks and priests, painted monks and priests a great deal too often. I frequently see, in pictures of real power, heads quite below the story of the painter, and I invariably observe that those heads are of the convent stamp, and have their counterparts among the convent inmates of this hour. So, I have settled with myself that, in such cases, the lameness was not with the painter, but with the vanity and ignorance of certain of his employers, who would be apostles on canvas at all events. The exquisite grace and beauty of Canova's statues, the wonderful gravity and repose of many of the ancient works in sculpture, both in the Capitol and the Vatican, and the strength and fire of many others, are, in their different ways, beyond all reach of words. They are especially impressive and delightful after the works of Bernini and his disciples, in which the churches of Rome, from St. Peter's downward, abound, and which are, I verily believe, the most detestable class of production in the wide world. I would infinitely rather, as mere works of art, look upon the three deities of the past, the present, and the future in the Chinese collection, than upon the best of these breezy maniacs, whose every fold of drapery is blown inside out, whose smallest vein or artery is as big as an ordinary forefinger, whose hair is like a nest of lively snakes, and whose attitudes put all other extravagance to shame. Insomuch that I do honestly believe there can be no place in the world where such intolerable abortions, begotten of the sculptor's chisel, are to be found in such profusion as in Rome. There is a fine collection of Egyptian antiquities in the Vatican, and the ceiling of the rooms in which they are arranged are painted to represent a starlight sky in the desert. It may seem an odd idea, but it is very effective. The grim, half-human monsters from the temples look more grim and monstrous underneath the deep dark blue. It sheds a strange uncertain gloomy air on everything, a mystery adapted to the objects, and you leave them as you find them, shrouded in a solemn night. In the private palaces, pictures are seen to the best advantage. There are seldom so many in one place that the attention need become distracted or the eye confused. You see them very leisurely, and are rarely interrupted by a crowd of people. There are portraits innumerable by Titan and Rembrandt and Van Dyck, heads by Guido and Domenichino and Carlo Dolci, various subjects by Correggio and Murillo and Raphael, and Salvador Rosa and Spagnoletto, many of which would be difficult indeed to praise too highly or to praise enough. Such is their tenderness and grace, their noble elevation, purity and beauty. The portrait of Beatrice de Cenci in the Palazzo Berberini is a picture almost impossible to be forgotten. Through the transcendent sweetness and beauty of the face, there is something shining out that haunts me. I see it now as I see this paper or my pen. The head is loosely draped in white, the light hair falling down below the linen folds. She has turned suddenly towards you, and there is an expression in the eyes, although they are very tender and gentle, as if the wildness of a momentary terror or distraction has been struggled with and overcome that instant, and nothing but a celestial hope and a beautiful sorrow and a desolate earthly helplessness remained. Some stories say that Guido painted it the night before her execution. Some other stories that he painted it from memory after having seen her on her way to the scaffold. I am willing to believe that, as you see her on his canvas, so she turned towards him in the crowd from the first sight of the axe, and stamped upon his mind a look which he has stamped upon mine, as though I had stood beside him in the concourse. The guilty palace of the Cenci, blighting a whole quarter of the town as it stands withering away by grains, had that face, to my fancy, in its dismal porch, and at its black, blind windows, and flitting up and down its dreary stairs, and growing out of the darkness of the ghostly galleries. The history is written in the painting, written in the dying girl's face by nature's own hand. And oh, how in that one touch she puts to flight, instead of making kin, the puny world that claims to be related to her in right of poor conventional forgeries. I saw in the Palazzo Spada the statue of Pompey, the statue at whose base Caesar fell, a stern, tremendous figure. I imagined one of greater finish, of the last refinement, full of delicate touches, losing its distinctness in the giddy eyes of one whose blood was ebbing before it, and settling into some such rigid majesty as this, as death came creeping over the upturned face. The excursions in the neighbourhood of Rome are charming, and would be full of interest were it only for the changing views they afford of the wild Campagna. But every inch of ground, in every direction, is rich in associations and in natural beauties. There is Albano, with its lovely lake and wooded shores, and with its wine that certainly has not improved since the day of Horace, and in these times hardly justifies his panegyric. There is squalid Tivoli, with the river Anio diverted from its course and plunging down headlong some 80 feet in search of it, with its picturesque temple of the Sibyl perched high on a crag, its minor waterfalls glancing and sparkling in the sun, and one good cavern yawning darkly where the river takes a fearful plunge and shoots on low down under beetling rocks. There too is the Villa d'Este, deserted and decaying among groves of melancholy pine and cypress trees, where it seems to lie in state. Then there is Frascati, and on the steep above it the ruins of Tusculum, where Cicero lived and wrote and adorned his favourite house. Some fragments of it may yet be seen there, and where Cato was born. We saw its ruined amphitheatre on a grey, dull day, when a shrill March wind was blowing, and when the scattered stones of the old city lay strewn about the lonely eminence, as desolate and dead as the ashes of a long extinguished fire. One day we walked out, a little party of 3, to Albano, 14 miles distant, possessed by a great desire to go there by the ancient Appian way, long since ruined and overgrown. We started at 7:30 in the morning, and within an hour or so were out upon the open Campagna. For 12 miles we went climbing on over an unbroken succession of mounds and heaps and hills of ruin. tombs and temples overthrown and prostrate, small fragments of columns, friezes, pediments, great blocks of granite and marble, mouldering arches, grass-grown and decayed, ruin enough to build a spacious city from, lay strewn about us. Sometimes loose walls built up from these fragments by the shepherds came across our path. Sometimes a ditch between two mounds of broken stones obstructed our progress. Sometimes the fragments themselves, rolling from beneath our feet, made it a toilsome matter to advance, but it was always ruin. Now we tracked a piece of the old road above the ground, now traced it underneath a grassy covering, as if that were its grave, but all the way was ruin. In the distance, ruined aqueducts went stalking on their giant course along the plain, and every breath of wind that swept towards us stirred up early flowers and grasses, springing up spontaneously on miles of ruin. The unseen larks above us, who alone disturbed the awful silence, had their nests in ruin. And the fierce herdsmen, clad in sheepskins, who now and then scowled out upon us from their sleeping nooks, were housed in ruin. The aspect of the desolate Campagna in one direction, where it was most level, reminded me of an American prairie. But what is the solitude of a region where men have never dwelt, to that of a desert, where a mighty race have left their footprint in the earth from which they have vanished, where the resting places of their dead have fallen like their dead, and the broken hourglass of time is but a heap of idle dust? Returning by the road at sunset, and looking from the distance on the course we had taken in the morning, I almost felt, as I had felt when I first saw it at that hour, as if the sun would never rise again, but looked its last that night upon a ruined world. To come again on Rome by moonlight after such an expedition is a fitting close to such a day. The narrow streets, devoid of footways and choked in every obscure corner by heaps of dunghill rubbish, contrast so strongly in their cramped dimensions and their filth and darkness with the broad square before some haughty church, in the centre of which a hieroglyphic-covered obelisk, brought from Egypt in the days of the emperors, looks strangely on the foreign scene about it. Or perhaps an ancient pillar, with its honoured statue overthrown, supports a Christian saint, Marcus Aurelius giving place to Paul, and Trajan to St. Peter. Then there are the ponderous buildings reared from the spoliation of the Colosseum, shutting out the moon-like mountains, while here and there are broken arches and rent walls, through which it gushes freely as the life comes pouring from a wound. The little town of miserable houses, walled and shut in by barred gates, is the quarter where the Jews are locked up nightly, when the clock strikes 8, a miserable place, densely populated and reeking with bad odours, but where the people are industrious and money-getting. In the daytime, as you make your way along the narrow streets, you see them all at work, upon the pavement, oftener than in their dark and frowsy shops, furbishing old clothes and driving bargains. Crossing from these patches of thick darkness out into the moon once more, the fountain of Trevi, welling from 100 jets and rolling over mimic rocks, is silvery to the eye and ear. In the narrow little throat of street, beyond a booth, dressed out with flaring lamps and boughs of trees, attract a group of sulky Romans round its smoky coppers of hot broth and cauliflower stew, its trays of fried fish and its flasks of wine. As you rattle round the sharply twisting corner, a lumbering sound is heard. The coachman stops abruptly and uncovers as a van comes slowly by, preceded by a man who bears a large cross, by a torch-bearer and a priest, the latter chaunting as he goes. It is the dead cart with the bodies of the poor on their way to burial in the sacred fields outside the walls, where they will be thrown into a pit that will be covered with a stone tonight and sealed up for a year. But whether, in this ride, you pass by obelisks or columns, ancient temples, theatres, houses, porticos or forums, it is strange to see how every fragment, whenever it is possible, has been blended into some modern structure and made to serve some modern purpose. A wall, a dwelling place, a granary, a stable, some use for which it never was designed, and associated with which it cannot otherwise than lamely assort. It is strange still to see how many ruins of the old mythology, how many fragments of obsolete legend and observance have been incorporated into the worship of Christian altars here, and how, in numberless respects, the false faith and the true are fused into a monstrous union. From one part of the city, looking out beyond the walls, a squat unstunted pyramid, the burial place of Caius Cestius, makes an opaque triangle in the moonlight. But to an English traveller it serves to mark the grave of Shelley too, whose ashes lie beneath a little garden near it. Nearer still, almost within its shadow, lie the bones of Keats, whose name is writ in water, that shines brightly in the landscape of a calm Italian night. The Holy Week in Rome is supposed to offer great attractions to all visitors, but, saving for the sights of Easter Sunday, I would counsel those who go to Rome for its own interest to avoid it all that time. The ceremonies, in general, are of the most tedious and wearisome kind, the heat and crowd at every one of them painfully oppressive, the noise, hubbub, and confusion quite distracting. We abandoned the pursuit of these shows very early in the proceedings, and betook ourselves to the ruins again. But we plunged into the crowd for a share of the best of the sights, and what we saw I will describe to you. At the Sistine Chapel on the Wednesday we saw very little, for by the time we reached it, though we were early, the besieging crowd had filled it to the door and overflowed into the adjoining hall, where they were struggling and squeezing and mutually expostulating and making great rushes every time a lady was brought out faint, as if at least 50 people could be accommodated in her vacant standing room. Hanging in the doorway of the chapel was a heavy curtain, and this curtain, some 20 people nearest to it, in their anxiety to hear the chaunting of the Miserere, were continually plucking at in opposition to each other that it might not fall down and stifle the sound of the voices. The consequence was that it occasioned the most extraordinary confusion, and seemed to wind itself about the unwary like a serpent. Now a lady was wrapped up in it, and couldn't be unwound. Now the voice of a stifling gentleman was heard inside it, beseeching to be let out. Now 2 muffled arms, no man can say of which sex, struggled in it as in a sack. Now it was carried by a rush bodily overhead into the chapel like an awning. Now it came out the other way and blinded one of the Pope's Swiss guard who had arrived at that moment to set things to rights. Being seated at a little distance among 2 or 3 of the Pope's gentlemen, who were very wary in counting the minutes, as perhaps His Holiness was too, we had better opportunities of observing this eccentric entertainment than of hearing the Miserere. Sometimes there was a swell of mournful voices that sounded very pathetic and sad, and died away into a lone strain again, but that was all we heard. At another time there was the exhibition of relics in St. Peter's, which took place at between 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening, and was striking from the cathedral being dark and gloomy, and having a great many people in it. The place into which the relics were brought one by a party of 3 priests was a high balcony near the chief altar. This was the only lighted part of the church. There are always 112 lamps burning near the altar, and there were 2 tall tapers besides near the black statue of St. Peter, but these were nothing in such an immense edifice. The gloom and the general upturning of faces to the balcony, and the prostration of true believers on the pavement as shining objects, like pictures or looking-glasses, were brought out and shown had something effective in it, despite the very preposterous manner in which they were held up for the general edification, and the great elevation at which they were displayed, which one would think rather calculated to diminish the comfort derivable from a full conviction of their being genuine. On the Thursday, we went to see the Pope convey the sacrament from the Sistine Chapel to deposit it in the Cappella Paolina, another chapel in the Vatican, a ceremony emblematical of the entombment of the Saviour before his resurrection. We waited in a great gallery with a great crowd of people, 3/4 of them being English, for an hour or so, while they were chaunting the Miserere in the Sistine Chapel again. Both chapels opened out of the gallery, and the general attention was concentrated on the occasional opening and shutting of the door of the one for which the Pope was ultimately bound. None of these openings disclosed anything more tremendous than a man on a ladder, lighting a great quantity of candles. But at each and every opening there was a terrific rush made at this ladder and this man, something like, I should think, a charge of the heavy British cavalry at Waterloo. The man was never brought down, however, nor the ladder, for it performed the strangest antics in the world among the crowd, where it was carried by the man when the candles were all lighted, and finally it was struck up against the gallery wall in a very disorderly manner just before the opening of the other chapel, and the commencement of a new chaunt announced the approach of His Holiness. At this crisis, the soldiers of the guard, who had been poking the crowd into all sorts of shapes, formed down the gallery, and the procession came up between the two lines they made. There were a few choristers, and then a great many priests, walking two and two, and carrying, the good-looking priests at least, their lighted tapers, so as to throw the light with a good effect upon their faces, for the room was darkened. Those who were not handsome, or who had not long beards, carried their tapers anyhow, and abandoned themselves to spiritual contemplation. Meanwhile, the chaunting was very monotonous and dreary. The procession passed on, slowly, into the chapel, and the drone of voices went on, and came on without it until the Pope himself appeared, walking under a white satin canopy, and bearing the covered sacrament in both hands. Cardinals and canons clustered round him, making a brilliant show. The soldiers of the guard knelt down as he passed, all the bystanders bowed, and so he passed on into the chapel, the white satin canopy being removed from over him at the door, and a white satin parasol hoisted over his poor old head in place of it. A few more couples brought up the rear and passed into the chapel also. Then the chapel door was shut, and it was all over, and everybody hurried off headlong, as for life or death, to see something else and say it wasn't worth the trouble. I think the most popular and most crowded sight, except in those of Easter Sunday and Monday, which are open to all classes of people, was the Pope washing the feet of the 13 men, representing the 12 apostles and Judas Iscariot. The place in which the pious office is performed is one of the chapels of St. Peter's, which is gaily decorated for the occasion. The 13 sitting, all of a row, on a very high bench, and looking particularly uncomfortable, with the eyes of heaven knows how many English, French, American, Swiss, Germans, Russians, Swedes, Norwegians, and other foreigners nailed to their faces all the time. They are robed in white, and on their heads they wear a stiff white cap, like a large English porter-pot without a handle. Each carries in his hand a nosegay of the size of a fine cauliflower, and 2 of them, on this occasion, wore spectacles, which, remembering the characters they sustained, I thought a droll appendage to the costume. There was a great eye to character. St. John was represented by a good-looking young man, St. Peter by a grave-looking old gentleman with a flowing brown beard, and Judas Iscariot by such an enormous hypocrite. I could not make out, though, whether the expression of his face was real or assumed, that if he had acted the part to the death and had gone away and hanged himself, he would have left nothing to be desired. as the 2 large boxes appropriated to ladies at this site were full to the throat, and getting near was hopeless, we posted off along with the great crowd to be in time at the table where the Pope, in person, waits on these 13, and after a prodigious struggle at the Vatican staircase and several personal conflicts with the Swiss guard, the whole crowd swept into the room. It was a long gallery hung with drapery of white and red, with another great box for ladies, who are obliged to dress in black at these ceremonies and to wear black veils, a royal box for the King of Naples and his party, and the table itself, which, set out like a ball supper and ornamented with golden figures of the real apostles, was arranged on an elevated platform on one side of the gallery. The counterfeit apostles' knives and forks were laid out on that side of the table which was nearest to the wall, so that they might be stared at again without let or hindrance. The body of the room was full of male strangers, the crowd immense, the heat very great, and the pressure sometimes frightful. It was at its height when the stream came pouring in from the feet-washing, and then there were such shrieks and outcries that a party of Piedemontese dragoons went to the rescue of the Swiss guard and helped them to calm the tumult. The ladies were particularly ferocious in their struggle for places. One lady of my acquaintance was seized round the waist in the ladies' box by a strong matron and hoisted out of her place. And there was another lady in a black row in the same box who improved her position by sticking a large pin into the ladies before her. The gentlemen about me were remarkably anxious to see what was on the table, and one Englishman seemed to have embarked on the whole energy of his nature in the determination to discover whether there was any mustard. "By Jupiter, there's vinegar," I heard him say to his friend, after he had stood on tiptoe an immense time, and had been crushed and beaten on all sides. "And there's oil. I saw them distinctly, in cruets. Can any gentleman in front there see mustard on the table? Sir, will you oblige me? Do you see a mustard pot?" The apostles and Judas, appearing on the platform after much expectation, were marshalled in line in front of the table, with Peter at the top, and a good long stare was taken at them by the company, while 12 of them took a long smell at their nosegays, and Judas, moving his lips very obtrusively, engaged in inward prayer. Then the Pope, clad in scarlet robe, and wearing on his head a skull-cap of white satin, appeared in the midst of a crowd of cardinals and other dignitaries, and took in his hand a little golden ewer, from which he poured a little water over one of Peter's hands, while one attendant held a golden basin, a second a fine cloth, a third Peter's nosegay, which was taken from him during the operation. This His Holiness performed with considerable expedition on every man in the line, Judas, I observed, to be particularly overcome by his condescension. And then the whole 13 sat down to dinner, Grace sat by the Pope, Peter in the chair. There was white wine and red wine, and the dinner looked very good. The courses appeared in portions, one for each apostle, and these, being presented to the Pope by cardinals upon their knees, were by him handed to the 13. The manner in which Judas grew more white-livered over his victuals, and languished with his head on one side, as if he had no appetite, defies all description. Peter was a good, sound old man, and went in, as the saying is, to win, eating everything that was given him. He got the best, being first in the row, and saying nothing to anybody. The dishes appeared to be chiefly composed of fish and vegetables. The Pope helped the 13 to wine also, and, during the whole dinner, somebody read something aloud out of a large book, the Bible, I presume, which nobody could hear, and to which nobody paid the least attention. The cardinals and other attendants smiled to each other from time to time, as if the thing were a great farce, and if they thought so, there is little doubt they were perfectly right. His Holiness did what he had to do, as a sensible man gets through a troublesome ceremony, and seemed very glad when it was all over. The pilgrim's supper where lords and ladies waited on the pilgrims in token of humility and dried their feet when they had been well washed by deputy, were very attractive. But of all the many spectacles of dangerous reliance on outward observance, in themselves mere empty forms, none struck me half so much as the Scala Santa, or Holy Staircase, which I saw several times, but to the greatest advantage or disadvantage on Good Friday. This Holy Staircase is composed of 28 steps, said to have belonged to Pontius Pilate's house, and to be the identical stairs on which our Saviour trod in coming down from the judgment seat. Pilgrims ascend it only on their knees. It is steep, and at the summit is a chapel reported to be full of relics, into which they peep through some iron bars, and then come down again by one of 2 side staircases, which are not sacred and may be walked on. On Good Friday there were, on a moderate computation, 100 people slowly shuffling up these stairs on their knees at one time, while others who were going up or had come down, a few who had done both and were going up again for the second time, stood loitering in the porch below, where an old gentleman in a sort of watch-box rattled a tin canister with a slit in the top incessantly to remind them that he took the money. The majority were country people, male and female. There were 4 or 5 Jesuit priests, however, and some half-dozen well-dressed women. A whole school of boys, 20 at least, were about halfway up, evidently enjoying it very much. They were all wedged together pretty closely, but the rest of the company gave the boys as wide a berth as possible, in consequence of their betraying some recklessness in the management of their boots. I never in my life saw anything at once so ridiculous and so unpleasant as this sight. Ridiculous in the absurd incidents inseparable from it, and unpleasant in its senseless and unmeaning degradation. There are 2 steps to begin with, and then a rather broad landing. The more rigid climbers went along this landing on their knees, as well as up the stairs, and the figures they cut, in their shuffling progress over the level surface, no description can paint. Then, to see them watch their opportunity from the porch and cut in where there was a place next to the wall. And to see one man with an umbrella, brought on purpose, for it was a fine day, hoisting himself unlawfully from stair to stair. And to observe a demure lady of 55 or so, looking back every now and then to assure herself that her legs were properly disposed. There were such odd differences in the speed of different people too. Some got on as if they were doing a match against time. Others stopped to say a prayer on every step. This man touched every stair with his forehead and kissed it. That man scratched his head all the way. The boys got on brilliantly, and were up and down again before the old lady had accomplished her 6 stairs. But most of the penitents came down very sprightly and fresh, as having done a real good substantial deed, which it would take a good deal of sin to counterbalance. And the old gentleman in the watch-box was down upon them with his canister while they were in this humour, I promise you. As if such a progress were not in its nature inevitably droll enough, there lay, on the top of the stairs, a wooden figure on a crucifix, resting on a sort of great iron saucer, so rickety and unsteady that whenever an enthusiastic person kissed the figure with more than usual devotion, or threw a coin into the saucer with more than common readiness, for it served in this respect as a second or supplementary canister, it gave a great leap and rattle, horribly frightening the people further down, and throwing the guilty party into unspeakable embarrassment. On Easter Sunday, as well as on the preceding Thursday, the Pope bestows his benediction on the people from the balcony in front of St. Peter's. This Easter Sunday was a day so bright and blue, so cloudless, balmy, wonderfully bright, that all the previous bad weather vanished from the recollection in a moment. I had seen the Thursday's benediction dropping damply on some hundreds of umbrellas, but there was not a sparkle then in all the 100 fountains of Rome, such fountains as they are. And on this Sunday morning there were running diamonds. The miles of miserable streets through which we drove, compelled to a certain course by the Pope's dragoons, the Roman police on such occasions, were so full of colour that nothing in them was capable of wearing a faded aspect. The common people came out in their gayest dresses, the richer people in their smartest vehicles, cardinals rattled to the church of the poor fishermen in their state carriages. Shabby magnificence flaunted its threadbare liveries and tarnished cocked hats in the sun, and every coach in Rome was put in requisition for the great piazza of St. Peter's. 150,000 people were there at least, yet there was ample room. How many carriages were there, I don't know. Yet there was room for them too, and to spare. The great steps of the church were densely crowded. There were many of the contadini from Albano who delight in red in that part of the square, and the mingling of bright colours in the crowd was beautiful. Below the steps the troops were arranged. In the magnificent proportions of the place they looked like a bed of flowers. Sulky Romans, lively peasants from the neighbouring country, groups of pilgrims from distant part of Italy, sight-seeing foreigners of all nations, made a murmur in the clear air like so many insects, and high above them all, plashing and bubbling and making rainbow colours in the light, the two delicious fountains welled and tumbled bountifully. A kind of bright carpet was hung over the front of the balcony, and the sides of the great window were bedecked with crimson drapery. An awning was stretched too over the top, to screen the old man from the hot rays of the sun. As noon approached, all eyes were turned up to this window. In due time, the chair was seen approaching to the front, with a gigantic fan of peacock's feathers close behind. The door within it, for the balcony is very high, then rose up and stretched out its tiny arms, while all the male spectators in the square uncovered, and some, but not by any means the greater part, kneeled down. The guns upon the ramparts of the castle of St. Angelo proclaimed, next moment, that the benediction was given. Drums beat, trumpets sounded, arms clashed, and the great mass below, suddenly breaking into smaller heaps and scattering here and there in rills, was stirred like party-coloured sand. What a bright noon it was as we rode away! The Tiber was no longer yellow, but blue. There was a blush on the old bridges that made them fresh and hale again. The Pantheon, with its majestic front, all seamed and furrowed like an old face, had summer light upon its battered walls. Every squalid and desolate hut in the Eternal City, bear witness every grim old palace to the filth and misery of the plebeian neighbour that elbows it as certain as time has laid its grip on his patrician head, was fresh and new with some ray of the sun. The very prison in the crowded street, a whirl of carriages and people, had some stray sense of the day, dropping through its chinks and crevices, and dismal prisoners, who could not wind their faces round the barricading of the blocked-up windows, stretched out their hands, and clinging to the rusty bars, turned them towards the overflowing street, as if it were a cheerful fire, and could be shared in that way. But when the night came on, without a cloud to dim the full moon, what a sight it was to see the great square full once more, and the whole church, from the cross to the ground, lighted with innumerable lanterns, tracing out the architecture, and winking and shining all round the colonnade of the piazza. And what a sense of exultation, joy, delight it was, when the great bell struck 7:30 on the instant, to behold one bright red mass of fire soar gallantly from the top of the cupola to the extremest summit of the cross, and the moment it leaped into its place to become the signal of a bursting out of countless lights, as great and red and blazing as itself, from every part of the gigantic church, so that every cornice, capital, and smallest ornament of the stone expressed itself in fire, and the black, solid groundwork of the enormous dome seemed to grow transparent as an eggshell. A train of gunpowder, an electric chain, nothing could be fired more suddenly and swiftly than this second illumination. and when we had got away and gone upon a distant height and looked towards it 2 hours afterwards, there it still stood, shining and glittering in the calm night like a jewel. Not a line of its proportions wanting, not an angle blunted, not an atom of its radiance lost. The next night, Easter Monday, there was a great display of fireworks from the castle of St. Angelo. We hired a room in an opposite house and made our way to our place in good time through a dense mob of people choking up the square in front and all the avenues leading to it, and so loading the bridge by which the castle is approached that it seemed ready to sink into the rapid Tiber below. There are statues on this bridge, execrable works, and among them great vessels full of burning tow were placed, glaring strangely on the faces of the crowd, and not less strangely on the stone counterfeits above them. The show began with tremendous discharge of cannon, and then, for 20 minutes or half an hour, the whole castle was one incessant sheet of fire, labyrinth of blazing wheels of every colour, size, and speed, while rockets streamed into the sky, not by ones or twos or scores, but hundreds at a time. The concluding burst, the girandola, was like the blowing up into the air of the whole massive castle without smoke or dust. In half an hour afterwards, the immense concourse had dispersed. The moon was looking calmly down upon her wrinkled image in the river, and half a dozen men and boys, with bits of lighted candle in their hands, moving here and there in search of anything worth having that might have been dropped in the press, had the whole scene to themselves. By way of contrast, we rode out into old ruined Rome after all this firing and booming to take our leave of the Colosseum. I had seen it by moonlight before. I could never get through a day without going back to it, but its tremendous solitude from that night is past all telling. The ghostly pillars in the forum, the triumphal arches of old emperors, those enormous masses of ruin which were once their palaces, the grass-grown mounds that mark the graves of ruined temples, the stones of the Via Sacra, smooth with the treads of feet in ancient Rome, even these were dimmed in their transcendent melancholy by the dark ghost of its bloody holidays, erect and grim, haunting the old scene, despoiled by pillaging popes and fighting princes, but not laid. Wringing wild hands of weed and grass and bramble, and lamenting to the night in every gap and broken arch, the shadow of its awful self immovable. As we lay down on the grass of the Campagna next day, on our way to Florence, hearing the larks sing, we saw that a little wooden cross had been erected on the spot where the poor pilgrim countess was murdered. So we piled some loose stones about it, as the beginning of a mound to her memory, and wondered if we should ever rest there again and look back at Rome. A rapid diorama. We are bound for Naples, and we crossed the threshold of the eternal city at yonder gate, the gate of San Giovanni Laterano, where the two last objects that attract the notice of a departing visitor, and the two first objects that attract the notice of an arriving one, are a proud church and a decaying ruin, good emblems of Rome. Our way lies over the Campagna, which looks more sullen on a bright blue day like this than beneath a darker sky, the great extent of ruin being plainer to the eye, and the sunshine through the arches of the broken aqueducts, showing other broken arches shining through them in the melancholy distance. When we have traversed it and look back from Albano, its dark, undulating surface lies below us like a stagnant lake, or like a broad, dull Lethe flowing round the walls of Rome, and separating it from all the world. How often have the legions, in triumphant march, gone glittering across that purple waste, so silent and unpeopled now? How often has the train of captives looked, with sinking hearts, upon the distant city, and beheld its population pouring out to hail the return of their conqueror? What riot, sensuality, and murder have run mad in the vast palaces, now heaps of bricks and shattered marble. What glare of fires and roar of popular tumult and wail of pestilence and famine have come sweeping over the wild plain where nothing is heard but the wind, and where the solitary lizards gambol unmolested in the sun. The train of wine carts going into Rome, each driven by a shaggy peasant reclining beneath a little gypsy-fashioned canopy of sheepskin, is ended now, and we go toiling up into a higher country where there are trees. The next day brings us on the Pontine marshes, wearily flat and lonesome, and overgrown with brushwood and swamped with water, but with a fine road made across them, shaded by a long, long avenue. Here and there we pass a solitary guardhouse, here and there a hovel, deserted and walled up. Some herdsmen loiter on the banks of the stream beside the road, and sometimes a flat-bottomed boat, towed by a man, comes rippling idly along it. A horseman passes occasionally, carrying a long gun crosswise on the saddle before him, and attended by fierce dogs. But there is nothing else astir save the wind and the shadows, until we come in sight of Terracina. How blue and bright the sea, rolling below the windows of the inn so famous in robber stories. How picturesque the great crags and points of rock overhanging tomorrow's narrow road, where galley slaves are working in the quarries above, and the sentinels who guard them lounge on the seashore. All night there is a murmur of the sea beneath the stars, and in the morning, just at daybreak, the prospect suddenly becoming expanded as if by a miracle reveals, in the far distance across the sea there, Naples with its islands and Vesuvius spouting fire. Within a quarter of an hour, the whole is gone as if it were a vision in the clouds, and there is nothing but the sea and sky. The Neapolitan frontier crossed after 2 hours' travelling, and the hungriest of soldiers and custom-house officers with difficulty appeased. We enter by a gateless portal into the first Neapolitan town, Fondi. Take note of Fondi in the name of all that is wretched and beggarly. A filthy channel of mud and refuse meander down the centre of the miserable streets, fed by obscene rivulets that trickle from the abject houses. There is not a door, a window, or a shutter, not a roof, a wall, a post, or a pillar in all Fondi, but is decayed and crazy and rotting away. The wretched history of the town, with all its sieges and pillages by Barbarossa and the rest, might have been acted last year. How the gaunt dogs that sneak about the miserable streets come to be alive and undevoured by the people is one of the enigmas of the world. A hollow-cheeked and scowling people they are, all beggars, but that's nothing. Look at them as they gather round. Some are too indolent to come downstairs, or too wisely mistrustful of the stairs perhaps to venture, so stretch out their lean hands from upper windows and howl. Others come flocking about us, fighting and jostling one another, and demanding incessantly charity for the love of God, charity for the love of the Blessed Virgin, charity for the love of all the saints. A group of miserable children, almost naked, screaming forth the same petition, discover that they can see themselves reflected in the varnish of the carriage, and begin to dance and make grimaces, that they might have the pleasure of seeing their antics repeated in this mirror. A crippled idiot, in the act of striking one of them who drowns his clamorous demand for charity, observes his angry counterpart in the panel, stops short, and thrusting out his tongue, begins to wag his head and chatter. The shrill cry raised at this awakens 6 wild creatures wrapped in frowsy brown cloaks, who are lying on the church steps with pots and pans for sale. These, scrambling up, approach and beg defiantly. "I am hungry. Give me something. Listen to me, signor. I am hungry." Then a ghastly old woman, fearful of being too late, comes hobbling down the street, stretching out one hand and scratching herself all the way with the other, and screaming, long before she can be heard, Charity! Charity! I'll go and pray for you directly, beautiful lady, if you'll give me charity. Lastly, the members of the Brotherhood for Burying the Dead, hideously masked and attired in shabby black robes, white at the skirts, with the splashes of many muddy winters, escorted by a dirty priest and a congenial cross-bearer, come hurrying past. Surrounded by this motley concourse, we move out of Fondi. Bad bright eyes glaring at us out of the darkness of every crazy tenement like glistening fragments of its filth and putrefaction. A noble mountain pass, with the ruins of a fort on a strong eminence, traditionally called the Fort of Fra Diavolo, the old town of Itri, like a device in pastry, built up almost perpendicularly on a hill and approached by a long steep flight of steps. Beautiful Mola di Gaeta, whose wines, like those of Albano, have degenerated since the days of Horace, or his taste for wine was bad, which is not likely of one who enjoyed it so much and extolled it so well. Another night upon the road at St. Agatha, a rest next day at Capua, which is picturesque, but hardly so seductive to a traveller now as soldiers of Praetorian Rome were wont to find the ancient city of that name. A flat road among vines festooned and looped from tree to tree, and Mount Vesuvius close at hand at last, its cone and summit whitened with snow, and its smoke hanging over it in the heavy atmosphere of the day like a dense cloud. So we go, rattling downhill into Naples. A funeral is coming up the street towards us. The body, on an open bier, borne on a kind of palanquin, covered with a gay cloth of crimson and gold. The mourners in white gowns and masks. If there be death abroad, life is well represented too, for all Naples would seem to be out of doors and tearing to and fro in carriages. Some of these, the common vetturino vehicles, are drawn by 3 horses abreast, decked with smart trappings and great abundance of brazen ornament, and always going very fast. Not that their loads are light, for the smallest of them has at least 6 people inside, 4 in front, 4 or 5 more hanging on behind, and 2 or 3 more in a net or bag below the axle tree, where they lie half suffocated with mud and dust. Exhibitors of punch, buffo singers with guitars, reciters of poetry, reciters of stories, a row of cheap exhibitions with clowns and showmen, drums and trumpets, painted cloths representing the wonders within, and admiring crowds assembled without, assist the whirl and bustle. Ragged lazzaroni lie asleep in doorways, archways, and kennels. The gentry, gaily dressed, are dashing up and down in carriages on the chiaggi, or walking in the public gardens, and quiet letter-writers, perched behind their little desks and inkstands under the portico of the great theatre of San Carlo in the public street, are waiting for clients. Here is a galley slave in chains, who wants a letter written to a friend. He approaches a clerkly-looking man sitting under the corner arch, and makes his bargain. He has obtained permission of the sentinel who guards him, who stands near, leaning against a wall and cracking nuts. The galley slave dictates in the ear of the letter-writer what he desires to say, and, as he can't read writing, looks intently in his face to read there whether he sets down faithfully what he is told. After a time, the galley slave becomes discursive, incoherent. The secretary pauses and rubs his chin. The galley slave is voluble and energetic. The secretary, at length, catches the idea, and with the air of a man who knows how to word it, sets it down, stopping now and then to glance back at his text admiringly. The galley slave is silent. The soldier stoically cracks his nuts. "Is there anything more to say?" inquires the letter-writer. "No more." "Then listen, friend of mine." He reads it through. The galley slave is quite enchanted. It is folded and addressed and given to him, and he pays the fee. The secretary falls back indolently in his chair and takes a book. The galley slave gathers up an empty sack. The sentinel throws away a handful of nutshells, shoulders his musket, and away they go together. Why do the beggars rub their chins constantly with their right hands when you look at them? Everything is done in pantomime in Naples, and that is a conventional sign for hunger. A man who is quarrelling with another yonder lays the palm of his right hand on the back of his left and shakes the two thumbs, expressive of a donkey's ears, whereat his adversary is goaded to desperation. Two people bargaining for fish, the buyer empties an imaginary waistcoat pocket when he is told the price and walks away without a word, having thoroughly conveyed to the seller that he considers it too dear. Two people in carriages, meeting, one touching his lip twice or thrice, holding up the 5 fingers of his right hand, and gives a horizontal cut in the air with the palm. The other nods briskly and goes his way. He has been invited to a friendly dinner at 5:30, and will certainly come. All over Italy, a peculiar shake of the right hand from the wrist, with the 4 fingers stretched out, expresses a negative. The only negative beggars will ever understand. But in Naples, those 5 fingers are a copious language. All this, and every other kind of outdoor life and stir, and macaroni eating at sunset, and flower selling all day long, and begging and stealing everywhere and at all hours, you see upon the bright seashore, where the waves of the bay sparkle merrily. But, lovers and hunters of the picturesque, let us not keep too studiously out of view the miserable depravity, degradation, and wretchedness with which this gay Neapolitan life is inseparably associated. It is not well to find St. Giles so repulsive, and the Porta Capuana so attractive. A pair of naked legs and a ragged red scarf do not make all the difference between what is interesting and what is coarse and odious? Painting and poetizing forever, if you will, the beauties of this most beautiful and lovely spot of earth, let us, as our duty, try to associate a new picturesque with some faint recognition of man's destiny and capabilities, more hopeful, I believe, among the ice and snow of the North Pole than in the sun and bloom of Naples. Capri, once made odious by the deified beast Tiberius, Ischia, Procida, and the 1,000 of distant beauties of the bay, lie in the blue sea yonder, changing in the mist and sunshine 20 times a day, now close at hand, now far off, now unseen. The fairest country in the world is spread about us. Whether we turn towards the Miseno shore of the splendid watery amphitheatre, and go by the grotto of Posiloppo to the grotto del Cane and away to Baie, or take the other way towards Vesuvius and Sorrento, it is one succession of delights. In the last named direction, where, over doors and archways, there are countless little images of San Gennaro, with his canute's hand stretched out to check the fury of the burning mountain, we are carried pleasantly by a railroad on the beautiful sea beach, past the town of Torre del Greco, built upon the ashes of the former town destroyed by the eruption of the Vesuvius within 100 years. And past the flat-roofed houses, granaries, and macaroni manufactories, to Castel Amare, with its ruined castle, now inhabited by fishermen standing in the sea upon a heap of rocks. Here the railroad terminates, but hence we may ride on, by an unbroken succession of enchanting bays and beautiful scenery, sloping from the highest summit of Sant' Angelo, the highest neighbouring mountain, down to the water's edge, among vineyards, olive trees, gardens of oranges and lemons, orchards, heaped-up rocks, green gorges in the hills, and by the bases of snow-covered heights, and through small towns with handsome, dark-haired women at the doors, and past delicious summer villas, to Sorrento, where the poet Tasso drew his inspiration from the beauty surrounding him. Returning, we may climb the heights above Castel Amare, and looking down among the boughs and leaves, see the crisp water glistening in the sun, and clusters of white houses in distant Naples dwindling in the great extent of prospect down to Dice. The coming back to the city by the beach again at sunset, with a glowing sea on one side and the darkening mountain with its smoke and flame upon the other, is a sublime conclusion to the glory of the day. That church by the Porta Capuana, near the old fisher market in the dirtiest quarter of dirty Naples, where the revolt of the Masaniello began, is memorable for having been the scene of one of his earliest proclamations to the people, and is particularly remarkable for nothing else, unless it be its waxen and bejewelled saint in a glass case with two odd hands, or the enormous number of beggars who are constantly rapping their chins there like a battery of castanets. The cathedral with the beautiful door and the column of African and Egyptian granite that once ornamented the temple of Apollo contains the famous sacred blood of San Gennaro or Januarius, which is preserved in 2 phials in a silver tabernacle and miraculously liquefies 3 times a year to the great admiration of the people. At the same moment, the stone, distant some miles, where the saint suffered martyrdom, becomes faintly red. It is said that the officiating priests turn faintly red also sometimes when these miracles occur. The old men who live in hovels at the entrance of these ancient catacombs, and who, in their age and infirmity, seem waiting here to be buried themselves, are members of a curious body called the Royal Hospital, who are the official attendants at funerals. 2 of these old spectres totter away with lighted tapers to show the caverns of death, as unconcerned as if they were immortal. They were used as burying places for 300 years, and in one part is a large pit full of skulls and bones, said to be the sad remains of a great mortality occasioned by a plague. In the rest there is nothing but dust. They consist chiefly of great wide corridors and labyrinths hewn out of the rock. At the end of some of these long passages are unexpected glimpses of the daylight shining down from above. It looks as ghastly and as strange, among the torches and the dust and the dark vaults, as if it too were dead and buried. The present burial place lies out yonder, on a hill between the city and Vesuvius. The old Camposanto, with its 365 pits, is only used for those who die in hospitals and prisons and are unclaimed by their friends. The graceful new cemetery, at no great distance from it, though yet unfinished, has already many graves among its shrubs and flowers and airy colonnades. It might be reasonably objected elsewhere that some of the tombs are meretricious and too fanciful, but the general brightness seems to justify it here, and Mount Vesuvius, separated from them by a lovely slope of ground, exalts and saddens the scene. If it be solemn to behold this new city of the dead, with its dark smoke hanging in the clear sky, how much more awful and impressive is it, viewed from the ghostly ruins of Herculaneum and Pompeii. Stand at the bottom of the great marketplace of Pompeii, and look up the silent streets, through the ruined temples of Jupiter and Isis, over the broken houses where their inmost sanctuaries open to the day, away to Mount Vesuvius, bright and snowy in the peaceful distance, and lose all count of time and heed of other things, in the strange and melancholy sensation of seeing the destroyed and the destroyer making this quiet picture in the sun. Then ramble on, and see at every turn the little familiar tokens of human habitation and everyday pursuits. The chafing of the bucket road in the stone rim of the exhausted well, the track of carriage wheels in the pavement of the street, the marks of drinking vessels on the stone counter of the wine shop, the amphora in the private cellars, stored away so many 100 years ago and undisturbed to this hour, all rendering the solitude and deadly lonesomeness of the place 10,000 times more solemn than if the volcano, in its fury, had swept the city from the earth and sunk it in the bottom of the sea. After it was shaken by the earthquake which preceded the eruption, workmen were employed in shaping out in stone new ornaments for temples and other buildings that had suffered. Here lies their work outside the city gate, as if they would return tomorrow. In the cellar of Diomede's house, where certain skeletons were found huddled together, close to the door, the impression of their bodies on the ashes hardened with the ashes and became stamped and fixed there after they had shrunk inside to scanty bones. So, in the theatre of Herculaneum, a comic mask, floating on the stream when it was hot and liquid, stamped its mimic features into it as it hardened into stone. And now it turns upon the stranger the fantastic look it turned upon the audiences in that same theatre 2,000 years ago. Next to the wonder of going up and down the streets and in and out of the houses and traverse the secret chambers of the temples of a religion that has vanished from the earth, and finding so many fresh traces of remote antiquity, as if the course of time had been stopped after this desolation, and there had been no nights and days, months, years, and centuries since. Nothing is more impressive and terrible than the many evidences of the searching nature of the ashes, as bespeaking their irresistible power and the impossibility of escaping them. In the wine cellars they forced their way into the earthen vessels, displacing the wine and choking them to the brim with dust. In the tombs they forced the ashes of the dead from the funeral urns and rained new ruin even into them. The mouths and eyes and skulls of all the skeletons were stuffed with this terrible hail. In Herculaneum, where the flood was of a different and heavier kind, it rolled in like a sea. Imagine a deluge of water turned to marble at its height. And that is what is called the lava here. Some workmen were digging the gloomy well on the brink of which we now stand, looking down, when they came on some of the stone benches of the theatre. Those steps, for such they seem, at the bottom of the excavation, and found the buried city of Herculaneum. Presently going down with lighted torches, we are perplexed by great walls of monstrous thickness, rising up between the benches, shutting out the stage, obtruding their shapeless forms in absurd places, confusing the whole plan, and making it a disordered dream. We cannot at first believe or picture to ourselves that this came rolling in and drowned the city, and that all that is not here has been cut away by the axe like solid stone. But this, perceived and understood, the horror and oppression of its presence are indescribable. Many of the paintings on the walls in the roofless chambers of both cities, or carefully removed to the museum at Naples, are as fresh and plain as if they had been executed yesterday. Here are subjects of still life, as provisions, dead game, bottles, glasses, and the like. Familiar classical stories, or mythological fables, always forcibly and plainly told. Conceits of cupids, quarrelling, sporting, working at trades. Theatrical rehearsals, poets reading their productions to their friends. Inscriptions chalked upon the walls, political squibs, advertisements, rough drawings by schoolboys, everything to people and restore the ancient cities in the fancy of their wandering visitor. Furniture too, you see, of every kind, lamps, tables, couches, vessels for eating, drinking and cooking, workmen's tools, surgical instruments, tickets for theatre, pieces of money, personal ornaments, bunches of keys found clenched in the grasp of skeletons, helmets of guards and warriors, little household bells, yet musical with their old domestic tones. The least among these objects lends its aid to swell the interest of Vesuvius, and invested with a perfect fascination. The looking, from either ruined city into the neighbouring grounds overgrown with beautiful vines and luxuriant trees, and remembering that house upon house, temple on temple, building after building, and street after street are still lying underneath the roots of all the quiet cultivation, waiting to be turned up to the light of day, is something so wonderful, so full of mystery, so captivating to the imagination, that one would think it would be paramount and yield to nothing else, to nothing but Vesuvius. But the mountain is the genius of the scene. From every indication of the ruin it has worked, we look, again, with an absorbing interest to where its smoke is rising up into the sky. It is beyond us as we thread the ruined streets, above us as we stand upon the ruined walls. We follow it through every vista of broken columns as we wander through the empty courtyards of the houses, and through the garlandings and interlacings of every wanton vine. Turning away to Paestum yonder, to see the awful structures built, the least aged of them, hundreds of years before the birth of Christ, and standing yet erect in lonely majesty upon the wild, malaria-blighted plain. We watch Vesuvius as it disappears from the prospect, and watch for it again on our return with the same thrill of interest, as the doom and destiny of all this beautiful country, bidding its terrible time. It is very warm in the sun on this early spring day when we return to Paestum, but very cold in the shade, insomuch that although we may lunch pleasantly at noon in the open air by the gate of Pompeii, the neighbouring rivulet supplies thick ice for our wine. But the sun is shining brightly. There is not a cloud or speck of vapour in the whole blue sky looking down upon the Bay of Naples, and the moon will be at the full tonight. No matter that the snow and ice lie thick upon the summit of Vesuvius, or that we have been on foot all day at Pompeii, or that croakers maintain that strangers should be not on the mountain by night in such an unusual season. Let us take advantage of the fine weather, make the best of our way to Resina, the little village at the foot of the mountain, prepare ourselves as well as we can on so short a notice at the guide's house, ascend at once, and have sunset halfway up, moonlight at the top, and midnight to come down in. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there is a terrible uproar in the little stable-yard of Signor Salvatore, the recognized head guide, with a gold band round his cap, and 30 under-guides who are all scuffling and screaming at once, are preparing a half-dozen saddled ponies, 3 litters, and some stout staves for the journey. Every one of the 30 quarrels with the other 29, and frightens the 6 ponies, and as much of the village as can possibly squeeze itself into the little stable-yard participates in the tumult and gets trodden on by the cattle. After much violent skirmishing, and more noise than would suffice for the storming of Naples, the procession starts. The head guide, who is liberally paid for all the attendance, rides a little in advance of the party. The other 30 guides proceed on foot. 8 go forward with the litters that are to be used by and by, and the remaining 22 beg. We ascend gradually, by stony lanes like rough broad flight of stairs, for some time. At length we leave these and the vineyards on either side of them, and emerge upon a bleak bare region where the lava lies confusedly in enormous rusty masses, as if the earth had been ploughed up by burning thunderbolts. And now we halt to see the sunset. The change that falls upon the dreary region, and on the whole mountain, as its red light fades, and the night comes on, and the unutterable solemnity and dreariness that reign around, who that has witnessed it can never forget. It is dark when, after winding for some time over the broken ground, we arrive at the foot of the cone, which is extremely steep and seemed to rise almost perpendicularly from the spot where we dismount. The only light is reflected from the snow, deep, hard, and white, with which the cone is covered. It is now intensely cold, and the air is piercing. The 31 have brought no torches, knowing that the moon will rise before we reach the top. 2 of the litters are devoted to the 2 ladies. The third, to a rather heavy gentleman from Naples, whose hospitality and good nature have attached him to the expedition and determined him to assist in doing the honours of the mountain. The rather heavy gentleman is carried by 15 men, each of the ladies by half a dozen. We who walk make the best use of our staves, and so the whole party begin to labour upward over the snow, as if they were toiling to the summit of an antediluvian 12th cake. We are a long time toiling up, and the head guide looks oddly about him when one of the company, not an Italian, though an habitué of the mountain for many years, whom we will call for our present purpose Mr. Pickle of Portici, suggests that, as it is freezing hard and the usual footing of ashes is covered by the snow and ice, it will surely be difficult to descend. But the sight of the litters above, tilting up and down, and jerking from this side to that, as the bearers continually slip and tumble, diverts our attention, more especially as the whole length of the rather heavy gentleman is, at that moment, presented to us alarmingly foreshortened, with his head downwards. The rising of the moon soon afterwards revives the flagging spirits of the bearers. Stimulating each other with their usual watchword, "Courage, friend! It is to eat macaroni!" they press on gallantly for the summit. From tinging the top of the snow above us with a band of light and pouring it in a stream through the valley below, while we have been ascending in the dark, the moon soon lights the whole white mountainside and the broad sea down below, and tiny Naples in the distance and every village in the country round. The whole prospect is in this lovely state when we come upon the platform on the mountain top, the region of fire, an exhausted crater formed of great masses of gigantic cinders, like blocks of stone from some tremendous waterfall burnt up, from every chink and crevice of which hot sulphurous smoke is pouring out, while from another conical-shaped hill, the present crater, rising abruptly from this platform at the end, great sheets of fire are streaming forth, reddening the night with flame, blackening it with smoke, and spotting it with red-hot stones and cinders that fly up into the air like feathers and fall down like lead. What words can paint the gloom and grandeur of this scene? The broken ground, the smoke, the sense of suffocation from the sulphur, the fear of falling down through the crevices in the yawning ground, the stopping every now and then for somebody who is missing in the dark, for the dense smoke now obscures the moon, the intolerable noise of the 30, and the hoarse roaring of the mountain, make it a scene of such confusion at the same time that we reel again. But, dragging the ladies through it, and across another exhausted crater to the foot of the present volcano, we approach close to it on the windy side, and then sit down among the hot ashes at its foot, and look up in silence, faintly estimating the action that is going on within, from its being full 100 feet higher at this minute than it was 6 weeks ago. There is something in the fire and roar that generates an irresistible desire to get nearer to it. We cannot rest long without starting off, 2 of us, on our hands and knees, accompanied by the head guide, to climb to the brim of the flaming crater and try to look in. Meanwhile, the 30 yell, as with one voice, that it is a dangerous proceeding and call us to come back, frightening the rest of the party out of their wits. What with their noise, and what with the trembling of the thin crust of ground that seems about to open underneath our feet and plunge us into the burning gulf below, which is the real danger if there be any, and what with the flashing of the fire in our faces, and the shower of red-hot ashes that is raining down, and the choking smoke and sulphur, we may well feel giddy and irrational like drunken men. But we contrive to climb up to the brim and look down for a moment into the hell of boiling fire below. Then we all 3 come rolling down, blackened and singed and scorched and hot and giddy, and each with his dress alight in half a dozen places. You have read 1,000 times that the usual way of descending is by sliding down the ashes, which, forming a gradually increasing ledge below the feet, prevent too rapid a descent. But when we have crossed the 2 exhausted craters in our way back and are coming to this precipitous place, there is, as Mr. Pickle has foretold, no vestige of ashes to be seen, the whole being a smooth sheet of ice. In this dilemma, 10 or a dozen of the guides cautiously join hands and make a chain of men, of whom the foremost beat, as well as they can, a rough track with their sticks, down which we prepare to follow. The way being fearfully steep, and none of the party, even of the 30, being able to keep their feet for 6 paces together, the ladies are taken out of their litters and placed, each between 2 careful persons, while others of the 30 hold by their skirts to prevent their falling forward, a necessary precaution tending to the immediate and hopeless dilapidation of their apparel. The rather heavy gentleman is abjured to leave his litter too, and be escorted in a similar manner, but he resolves to be brought down as he was brought up, on the principle that his 15 bearers are not likely to tumble all at once, and that he is safer so than trusting to his own legs. In this order we begin the descent, sometimes on foot, sometimes shuffling on the ice, always proceeding much more quietly and slowly than on our upward way, and constantly alarmed by the falling among us of somebody from behind, who endangers the footing of the whole party, and clings pertinaciously to anybody's ankles. It is impossible for the litter to be in advance too, as the tracks have to be made, and its appearance behind us overhead, with some one or other of the bearers always down, and the rather heavy gentleman with his legs always in the air, is very threatening and frightful. We have gone on thus a very little way, painfully and anxiously, but quite merrily, and regarding it as a great success, and have fallen several times, and have all been stopped somehow or other as we were sliding away, when Mr. Pickle of Portici, in the act of remarking on these uncommon circumstances, as quite beyond his experience, stumbles, falls, disengages himself with quick presence of mind from those around him, plunges away head foremost, and rolls over and over down the whole surface of the cone. Sickening as it is to look, and be so powerless to help him, I see him there in the moonlight. I have such a dream often, skimming over the white ice like a cannonball. Almost at the same time there is a cry from behind, and a man who has carried a light basket of spare cloaks on his head comes rolling past at the same frightful speed, closely followed by a boy. At this climax of the chapter of accidents, the remaining 28 vociferate to that degree that a pack of wolves would be music to them. Giddy and bloody, and a mere bundle of rags, is Pickle of Portici when we reach the place where we dismounted, and where the horses are waiting, but, thank God, sound and limp. And never are we likely to be more glad to see a man alive and on his feet than to see him now, making light of it too, though sorely bruised and in great pain. The boy is brought into the hermitage of the mountain, while we are at supper, with his head tied up, and the man is heard of some hours afterwards. He too is bruised and stunned, but has broken no bones, the snow having, fortunately, covered all the larger blocks of rocks and stone, and rendered them harmless. After a cheerful meal and a good rest before a blazing fire, we again take horse and continue our descent to Salvatore's house, very slowly, by reason of our bruised friend being hardly able to keep the saddle or endure the pain of motion. Though it is so late at night or early in the morning, all the people of the village are waiting about the little stable yard when we arrive, and looking up the road by which we are expected. Our appearance is hailed with a great clamour of tongues, and a general sensation, for which, in our modesty, we are somewhat at a loss to account, until, turning into the yard, we find that one of the party of French gentlemen who were on the mountain at the same time is lying on some straw in the stable, with a broken limb, looking like death, and suffering great torture, and that we were confidently supposed to have encountered some worse accident. So, well returned, and heaven be praised, as the cheerful Vetturino, who has borne us company all the way from Pisa, says with all his heart, and away with his ready horses in to sleep in Naples. It wakes again to Policinelli and pickpockets, buffo singers and beggars, rags, puppets, flowers, brightness, dirt, and universal degradation, airing its harlequin suit in the sunshine next day and every day, singing, starving, dancing, gaming on the seashore, and leaving all labour to the burning mountain, which is never at its work. Our English dilettanti would be very pathetic on the subject of national taste if they could hear an Italian opera half as badly sung in England as we may hear the Foscari performed tonight in the splendid theatre of San Carlo. But, for astonishing truth and spirit in seizing and embodying the real life about it, the shabby little San Carlino theatre, the rickety house 1 story high, with a starring picture outside, down among the drums and trumpets and the tumblers and the lady conjurer, is without a rival anywhere. There is one extraordinary feature in the real life of Naples at which we may take a glance before we go: the lotteries. They prevail in most part of Italy, but are particularly obvious in their effects and influences here. They are drawn every Saturday. They bring an immense revenue to the government, and diffuse a taste for gambling among the poorest of the poor, which is very comfortable to the coffers of the state, and very ruinous to themselves. The lowest stake is 1 grain, less than a farthing. 100 numbers, from 1 to 100 inclusive, are put into a box. 5 are drawn. Those are the prizes. I buy 3 numbers. If one of them comes up, I win a small prize. If 2, some hundreds of times my stake. If 3, 3,500 times my stake. I stake, or play, as they call it, what I can upon my numbers, and buy what numbers I please. The amount I play, I pay at the lottery office, where I purchase the ticket, and it is stated on the ticket itself. Every lottery office keeps a printed book, an universal lottery diviner, where every possible accident and circumstance is provided for, and has a number against it. For instance, let us take 2 Carlini, about 7d. On our way to the lottery office, we run against a black man. When we get there, we say gravely, "The diviner." It is handed over the counter as a serious matter of business. We look at black man. "Such a number. Give us that." We look at running against a person in the street. "Give us that." We look at the name of the street itself. "Give us that." Now we have our 3 numbers. If the roof of the theatre of San Carlo were to fall in, so many people would play upon the numbers attached to such an accident in the diviner, that the government would soon close those numbers, and decline to run the risk of losing any more upon them. This often happens. Not long ago, when there was a fire in the king's palace, there was such a desperate run on fire, the king and palace, that further stakes on the numbers attached to those words in the Golden Book were forbidden. Every accident or event is supposed by the ignorant populace to be a revelation to the beholder or party concerned in connection with the lottery. Certain people who have a talent for dreaming fortunately are much sought after, and there are some priests who are constantly favoured with visions of the lucky numbers. I heard of a horse running away with a man and dashing him down dead at the corner of a street. Pursuing the horse with incredible speed was another man who ran so fast that he came up immediately after the accident. He threw himself upon his knees beside the unfortunate rider and clasped his hand with an expression of the wildest grief. "If you have life," he said, "speak 1 word to me. If you have 1 gasp of breath left, mention your age for heaven's sake, that I may play that number in the lottery." It is 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we may go to see our lottery drawn. The ceremony takes place every Saturday in the Tribunale, or Court of Justice. This singular, earthy-smelling room or gallery, as mouldy as an old cellar and as damp as a dungeon. At the upper end is a platform, with a large horseshoe table upon it, and a president and council sitting round, all judges of the law. The man on the little stool behind the president is the Capolazzarone, a kind of tribunal of the people, appointed on their behalf to see that all is fairly conducted, attended by a few personal friends. A ragged, swarthy fellow he is, with long matted hair hanging down all over his face, and covered from head to foot with most unquestionably genuine dirt. All the body of the room is filled with the commonest of the Neapolitan people, and between them and the platform, guarding the steps leading to the latter, is a small body of soldiers. There is some delay in the arrival of the necessary number of judges, during which the box, in which the numbers are being placed, is a source of the deepest interest. When the box is full, the boy who is to draw the numbers out of it becomes the prominent figure of the proceedings. He is already dressed for his part, in a tight brown holland coat with only one, the left, sleeve to it, which leaves his right arm bared to the shoulder, ready for plunging down into the mysterious chest. During the hush and whisper that pervades the room, all eyes are turned on this young minister of fortune. People begin to inquire his age, with a view to the next lottery, the number of his brothers and sisters, and the age of his father and mother, and whether he has any moles or pimples upon him, and where, and how many. When the arrival of the last judge but one, a little old man universally dreaded as possessing the evil eye, makes a slight diversion, and would occasion a greater one, but that he is immediately deposed as a source of interest by the officiating priest, who advances gravely to his place, followed by a very dirty little boy, carrying his sacred vestments and a pot of holy water. Here is the last judge come at last, and now he takes his place at the horseshoe table. There is a murmur of irrepressible agitation. In the midst of it, the priest puts his head into the sacred vestments, and pulls the same over his shoulders. Then he says a silent prayer, and dipping a brush into the pot of holy water, sprinkles it over the box, and over the boy, and gives them both a double-barrelled blessing, which the box and the boy are both hoisted on the table to receive. The boy remaining on the table, the box is now carried round the front of the platform by an attendant, who holds it up and shakes it lustily all the time, seeming to say, like the conjurer, "There is no deception, ladies and gentlemen. Keep your eyes upon me, if you please." At last, the box is set before the boy, and the boy, first holding up his naked arm and open hand, dives down into the hole, it is made like a ballot box, and pulls out a number, which is rolled up round something hard like a bonbon. This he hands to the judge next to him, who unrolls a little bit and hands it to the president next to whom he sits. The president unrolls it very slowly. The Capolazzarone leans over his shoulder. The president holds it up, unrolled, to the Capolazzarone. The Capolazzarone, looking at it eagerly, cries out in a shrill, loud voice, "62! 62!" expressing the 2 upon his fingers as he calls it out. Alas, the Capolazzarone himself has not staked on 62. His face is very long, and his eyes roll widely. As it happens to be a favourite number, however, it is pretty well received, which is not always the case. They are all drawn with the same ceremony, omitting the blessing. One blessing is enough for the whole multiplication table. The only new incident in the proceedings is the gradually deepening intensity of the change in the Capolazzarone, who has evidently speculated to the very utmost extent of his means, and who, when he sees the last number and finds that it is not one of his, clasps his hands and raises his eyes to the ceiling before proclaiming it, as though remonstrating in a secret agony with his patron saint for having committed so gross a breach of confidence. I hope the Capolazzarone may not desert him for some other member of the calendar, but he seems to threaten it. Where the winners may be, nobody knows. They certainly are not present, the general disappointment filling one with pity for the poor people. They look, when we stand aside observing them in their passage through the courtyard down below, as miserable as the prisoners in the jail, It forms a part of the building, who are peeping down upon them from between their bars, or as the fragments of human heads which are still dangling in chains outside, in memory of the good old times when their owners were strung up there for the popular edification. Away from Naples in a glorious sunrise by the road to Capua, and then on a 3 days' journey along by-roads, that we may see on the way the monastery of Monte Cassino, which is perched on the steep and lofty hills above the little town of San Germano, and is lost on a misty morning in the clouds. So much the better for the deep sounding of its bells, which, as we go winding up on mules towards the convent, is heard mysteriously in the still air, while nothing is seen but the grey mist, moving solemnly and slowly like a funeral procession. Behold at length the shadowy pile of building close before us, its grey walls and towers dimly seen, though so near and so vast, and the raw vapour rolling through its cloisters heavily. There are 2 black shadows walking to and fro in the quadrangle, near the statues of the patron saint and his sister, and hopping on behind them, in and out of the old arches, is a raven, croaking in answer to the bell, and uttering, at intervals, the purest Tuscan. How like a Jesuit he looks! There never was a sly and stealthy fellow so at home as this raven, standing now at the refectory door, with his head on one side, and pretending to glance another way, while he is scrutinizing the visitors keenly, and listening with fixed attention. What a dull-headed monk the porter becomes in comparison. "He speaks like us," says the porter, "quite as plainly." "Quite as plainly, porter." Nothing could be more expressive than his reception of the peasants who are entering the gate with baskets and burdens. There is a roll in his eye, and a chuckle in his throat, which should qualify him to be chosen superior of an order of ravens. He knows all about it. "It's all right," he says. "We know what we know. Come along, good people. Glad to see you." How this extraordinary structure ever built in such a situation, where the labour of conveying the stone and iron and marble so great a height must have been prodigious. "Caw!" says the raven, welcoming the peasants. How, being despoiled by plunder, fire, and earthquake, has it risen from its ruins, and been again made what we now see it, with its church so sumptuous and magnificent? "Cow!" says the raven, welcoming the peasants. These people have a miserable appearance, and, as usual, are densely ignorant and all beg, while the monks are chaunting in the chapel. "Cow!" says the raven. "Cuckoo!" So we leave him, chuckling and rolling his eyes at the convent gate, and wind slowly down again through the cloud. At last, emerging from it, we come in sight of the village far below, and the flat green country intersected by rivulets, which is pleasant and fresh to see after the obscurity and haze of the convent. No disrespect to the raven, or the holy friars. Away we go again, by muddy roads, and through the most shattered and tattered of villages, where there is not a whole window among all the houses, or a whole garment among all the peasants, or the least appearance of anything to eat, in any of the wretched hucksters' shops. The women wear a bright red bodice, laced before and behind, a white skirt, and the Neapolitan head-dress of square folds of linen, primitively meant to carry loads on. The men and children wear anything they can get. The soldiers are as dirty and rapacious as the dogs. The inns are such hobgoblin places that they are infinitely more attractive and amusing than the best hotels in Paris. Here is one near Valmontone, that is, Valmontone, the round-walled town on the mount opposite, which is approached by a quagmire almost knee-deep. There is a wild colonnade below, and a dark yard full of empty stables and lofts, and a great long kitchen with a great long bench, and a great long form where a party of travellers, with 2 priests among them, are crowded round the fire while their supper is cooking. Above stairs is a rough brick gallery to sit in, with very little windows with very little patches of knotty glass in them, and all the doors that open from it, a dozen or 2, off their hinges, and a bare board of trestles for a table, at which 30 people might dine easily, and a fireplace large enough in itself for a breakfast parlour, where, as the faggots blaze and crackle, they illuminate the ugliest and grimmest of faces, drawn in charcoal on the whitewashed chimney sides by previous travellers. There is a flaring country lamp on the table, and, hovering about it, scratching her thick black hair continually, a yellow dwarf of a woman who stands on tiptoe to arrange the hatchet knives, and takes a flying leap to look into the water jug. The beds in the adjoining rooms are of the liveliest kind. There is not a solitary scrap of looking-glass in the house, and the washing apparatus is identical with the cooking utensils. But the yellow dwarf sets on the table a good flask of excellent wine, holding a quart at least, and produces, among half a dozen other dishes, 2/3 of a roasted kid smoking hot. She is as good-humoured too as dirty, which is saying a great deal. So here's long life to her in the flask of wine, and prosperity to the establishment. Rome gained and left behind, and with it the pilgrims who are now repairing to their own homes again, each with his scalloped shelf and staff, and soliciting alms for the love of God, we come by a fair country to the falls of Terni, where the whole Velino river dashes headlong from a rocky height amidst shining spray and rainbows. Perugia, strongly fortified by art and nature, on a lofty eminence rising abruptly from the plain where purple mountains mingle with the distant sky, is glowing on its market day with radiant colours. They set off its sombre but rich Gothic buildings admiringly. The pavement of its market-place is strewn with country goods. All along the steep hill leading from the town under the town wall, there is a noisy fair of calves, lambs, pigs, horses, mules, and oxen. Fowl, geese, and turkeys flutter vigorously among their very hoofs, and buyers, sellers, and spectators, clustering everywhere, block up the road as we come shouting down upon them. Suddenly there is a ringing sound among our horses. The driver stops them. Sinking in his saddle and casting up his eyes to heaven, he delivers this apostrophe: "O Jove omnipotente! Here is a horse has lost his shoe." Notwithstanding the tremendous nature of this accident, and the utterly forlorn look and gesture, impossible in anyone but an Italian vetturino, with which it is announced, it is not long in being repaired by a mortal farrier, by whose assistance we reach Castiglione the same night, and Arezzo next day. Mass is, of course, performing in its fine cathedral, where the sun shines in amongst the cluttered pillars through rich stained glass windows, half revealing, half concealing the kneeling figures on the pavement, and striking out paths of spotted light in the long aisles. But how much beauty of another kind is here, when, on a fair clear morning, we look from the summit of a hill on Florence. See where it lies before us in a sun-lighted valley, bright with a winding Arno and shut in by swelling hills, its domes and towers and palaces rising from the rich country in a glittering heap, and shining in the sun like gold. Magnificently stern and sombre are the streets of beautiful Florence, and the strong old piles of building make such heaps of shadow on the ground and in the river, that there is another and a different city of rich forms and fancies always lying at our feet. Prodigious palaces constructed for defence, with small distrustful windows heavily barred, and walls of great thickness, formed of huge masses of rough stone, frown in their old sulky state on every street. In the midst of the city, in the piazza of the Grand Duke, adorned with beautiful statues and the fountain of Neptune, rises the Palazzo Vecchio, with its enormous overhanging battlements, and the great tower that watches over the whole town. In its courtyard, worthy of the castle of Otranto in its ponderous gloom, is a massive staircase that the heaviest wagon and the stoutest team of horses might be driven up. Within it is a great saloon, faded and tarnished in its stately decorations, and mouldering by grains, but recording yet, in pictures on its walls, the triumphs of the Medici and the wars of the old Florentine people. The prison is hard by, in an adjacent courtyard of the building, a foul and dismal place where some men are shut up close in small cells like ovens, and where others look through bars and beg, where some are playing draughts and some are talking to their friends who smoke the while to purify the air, and some are buying wine and fruit of women vendors, and all are squalid, dirty, and vile to look at. "There are merry enough, signore," says the jailer. "There are all blood-stained here," he adds, indicating with his hand 3/4 of the whole building. Before the hour is out, an old man 80 years of age, quarrelling over a bargain with a young girl of 17, stabs her dead in the marketplace full of bright flowers, and is brought herein prisoner to swell the number. Among the 4 old bridges that span the river, the Ponte Vecchio, that bridge which is covered with the shops of jewellers and goldsmith, is a most enchanting feature in the scene. The space of one house in the centre being left open, the view beyond is shown as in a frame, and that precious glimpse of sky and water and rich buildings, shining so quietly among the huddled roofs and gables on the bridge, is exquisite. Above it, the gallery of the Grand Duke crosses the river. It was built to connect the 2 great palaces by a secret passage, and it takes its jealous course among the streets and houses with true despotism, going where it lists and spurning every obstacle away before it. The Grand Duke has a worthier secret passage through the streets, in his black robe and hood, as a member of the Compagnia della Misericordia, which brotherhood includes all ranks of men. If an accident take place, their office is to raise the sufferer and bear him tenderly to the hospital. If a fire breaks out, it is one of their functions to repair to the spot and render their assistance and protection. It is also among their commonest offices to attend and console the sick, and they neither receive money nor eat nor drink in any house they visit for this purpose. Those who are on duty for the time are all called together on a moment's notice by the tolling of the great bell of the tower, and it is said that the Grand Duke has been seen at this sound to rise from his seat at table and quietly withdraw to attend the summons. In this other large piazza, where an irregular kind of market is held, and stores of old iron and other small merchandise are set out on stalls or scattered on the pavement, are grouped together the cathedral with its great dome, the beautiful Italian Gothic tower, the Campanile, and the baptistry with its wrought bronze doors. And here, a small untrodden square in the pavement, is the stone of Dante, where, so runs the story, he was used to bring his stool and sit in contemplation. I wonder was he ever, in his bitter exile, withheld from cursing the very stones in the streets of Florence the ungrateful by any kind remembrance of this old musing place, and its association with gentle thoughts of little Beatrice. The Chapel of the Medici, the good and bad angels of Florence, the Church of Santa Croce, where Michelangelo lies buried, and where every stone in the cloisters is eloquent on great men's deaths. Innumerable churches, often masses of unfinished heavy brickwork externally, but sullen and serene within, arrest our lingering steps in strolling through the city. In keeping with the tombs among the cloisters is the Museum of Natural History, famous through the world for its preparations in wax, beginning with models of leaves, seeds, plants, inferior animals, and gradually ascending through separate organs of the human frame up to the whole structure of that wonderful creation exquisitely presented as in recent death. Few admonitions of our frail mortality can be more sullen and more sad, or strike so home upon the heart, as the counterfeits of youth and beauty that are lying there upon their beds in their last sleep. Beyond the walls, the whole sweet valley of the Arno, the convent at Fiesole, the tower of Galileo, Boccaccio's house, old villas and retreats, innumerable spots of interest, all glowing in a landscape of surpassing beauty, steeped in the richest light, are spread before us. Returning from so much brightness, how sullen and how grand the streets again, with their great, dark, mournful palaces and many legends, not of siege and war and might and iron hand alone, but of the triumphant growth of peaceful arts and sciences. What light is shed upon the world at this day from amidst these rugged palaces of Florence! Here, open to all comers, in their beautiful and calm retreats, the ancient sculptures are immortal, side by side with Michelangelo, Canova, Titan, Rembrandt, Raphael, poets, historians, philosophers, those illustrious men of history, beside whom its crowned heads and harnessed warriors show so poor and small and are so soon forgotten. Here the imperishable part of noble minds survives, placid and equal, when strongholds of assault and defence are overthrown, when the tyranny of the many or the few, or both, is but a tale, when pride and power are so much cloistered dust. The fire within the stern streets, and among the massive palaces and towers, kindled by rays from heaven, is still burning brightly, when the flickering of war is extinguished, and the household fires of generations have decayed. As thousands upon thousands of faces, rigid with the strife and passion of the hour, have faded out of the old squares and public haunts, while the nameless Florentine lady, preserved from oblivion by a painter's hand, yet lives on in endearing grace and youth. Let us look back on Florence while we may, and when its shining dome is seen no more, go travelling through cheerful Tuscany with a bright remembrance of it, for Italy will be the fairer for the recollection. The summer-time being come, and Genoa and Milan and the Lake of Como lying far behind us, and we resting at Faido, a Swiss village near the awful rocks and mountains, the everlasting snows and roaring cataracts of the great St. Gothard, hearing the Italian tongue for the last time on this journey, let us part from Italy with all its miseries and wrongs affectionately, in our admiration of the beauties, natural and artificial, of which it is full to overflowing, and in our tenderness towards a people naturally well disposed and patient and sweet-tempered. Years of neglect, oppression, and misrule have been at work to change their nature and reduce their spirit. Miserable jealousies, fomented by petty princes, to whom union was destruction and division strength, have been a canker at their root of nationality, and have barbarized their language. But the good that was in them ever is in them yet, and a noble people may be, one day, raised up from these ashes. Let us entertain that hope, and let us not remember Italy the less regardfully because, in every fragment of her fallen temples, and in every stone of her deserted palaces and prisons, she helps to inculcate the lesson that the wheel of time is rolling for an end, and that the world is, in all great essentials, better, gentler, more forbearing, and more hopeful as it rolls. The End.